Chapter 576. On Dong Mountain. In order to ensure the harmony and ruthlessness of this strike, Xueqi had poured all of his energy into it. If he had to deal with the flowing cloud Yi Luyun sent out, he would have to pull back his sword. If he didn't, he could only attack the enemy's weakness. However, he could only split out a sliver of his attention. Of the 5 people present, the only person he could kill with just a sliver of his attention was the Qing Kingdom's emperor, who had an empty aura. It had to be said that from the beginning of Xueqi's attack, in terms of aura and intelligence, he had suppressed Yi Luyun. At this moment, he gave Yi Luyun a difficult problem and a surprise. What made Xueqi surprised, angry, uneasy, and at a loss was that Yi Luyun did not pay any attention to the empty sword Xueqi held. That ball of flowing cloud continued to move toward his face. The empty sword in his hand, after emitting a faint chi sound, pierced through the wet stone slabs of the mountain peak and fell into the air. The bright yellow and dim eyes on the dragon robe suddenly and strangely disappeared from the front of the empty sword. On the summit of Dong Mountain, 4 great grandmasters, and an emperor. Everything seemed to take a long time. In reality, it only happened in a second. In this second, Xueqi used the sword in his hand to pick up Yi Luyun's cloud and used the empty sword to stab toward the Qing emperor. On the other side of this second, an even more hair-raising story happened. This story happened at the beginning of this second. When Xueqi's sword flew to within a foot of the Qing emperor's back, the emperor had already sighed darkly and released the old hand that had been holding Xueqi the entire time. It was as if he did not want this old man to be unable to enjoy the last battle of his life. At this moment, the Northern Qi Imperial Advisor Xueqi's hand was perseveringly brushing against old Xueqi's chest. This brush and press, with his thumb and index finger slightly apart, was like a cool breeze brushing against a mountain. It was gentle and natural. It was completely different from the storm and lightning around them. However, when the wind brushed past, the mountain was thrown into chaos for no reason. Old Xueqi gazed calmly at Xueqi's face. His hands were like a pair of dragon whips, twisting and changing shape as they climbed onto Xueqi's right arm. However, they did not stop his brush. With a muffled thud, old Xueqi's chest completely shattered. Under Xueqi's natural and refreshing brush that contained the might of heaven and earth, his sternum was like a fragile piece of tofu. They all collapsed and caved in. Blood gushed out of old Xueqi's nose, and mouth. His life force was rapidly drained away as his sternum caved in. His blood gushed out wildly, and his vital energy flowed out. However, there was a hint of a faint smile, mockery, and killing intent in his aged eyes. An abyss-like feeling of emptiness came from his palm. Master Xueqi's pupils suddenly constricted. This was the oldest great-grandmaster present, the uncle of the founding emperor of Northern Qi, and the once brilliant ascetic monk of the Wei Kingdom. No one knew how many things had happened in his life. He had gone to the temple to seek the way and discussed martial arts with the world. His temperament was steady and natural. No one could compare to him. Today, the 4 great grandmasters were gathered at Dong Mountain. He had to pick up his sense of gain and loss again. He had to pull the heart of victory and defeat back into his hands. The tyrannical Xueqi emanating from the body of this old eunuch, who had hidden himself in the Qing kingdom for many years, was like the dry wind in the surroundings. The realm hidden within was, without question, that he was already a proper grandmaster. Thus, Master Xueqi did not hold back. He did not dare to hold back. This second brush of leaning against the mountains and rivers already contained the bottomless heavens path Xueqi in his body. In a battle between great grandmasters, some shocking changes could happen at any time. Thus, when Xueqi's brush landed on old Xueqi's chest, he did not feel a glimmer of joy. The first brush had already been forcefully bounced back by the tyrannical Xueqi in old Xueqi's body. Although this kind of qi circulation method was overly tyrannical and could not be maintained for long, Xueqi thought that old Xueqi would certainly have a way to deal with his second brush. However, old Xueqi did not manage to block this brush. His chest shattered. The tyrannical aura on the old eunuch's body disappeared without a trace in an instant. No one knew where it had gone. Even if old Xueqi's chest suddenly became a metal plate and grew a second head, perhaps Xueqi would not be surprised. Yet, this scene made Xueqi feel incredulous. Where did the abundant and irresistible tyrannical Xueqi go? In the end, a great grandmaster was a person and not a god. Even with his and Xueqi's miraculous cultivation, It was impossible for them to abruptly disperse the aura that had already reached the peak of the human world in such a short time. It was like a ball filled with energy. How could it completely dissipate in an instant? The transfer of any kind of energy always required time. The shorter the time, the more terrifying the shaking during this process. Regardless of whether it was Xueqi, Sigajian, or Yiluyun, if they were like old Yunakong and completely released all of the zhenqi in their bodies in such a short time, they could not avoid the fate of their bodies falling apart and dying in the next moment. Why? Why could old Yunakong do this? Why did he dare to do this? Xueqi's pupils constricted. A raindrop stopped half an inch in front of his eyelids, reflecting a faint black light. He unconsciously sensed an unfamiliar sense of danger, the sense of death. In his long journey of life, the last time Master Xueqi had sunk into such a state of mind was when he reunited with a blind man in the 5th year of the Qing calendar. However, the danger he sensed then was not as great as now. When these thoughts swept through Master Xueqi's mind like a sky full of raindrops, his gentle right hand had already shattered Hong Xiang's sternum. Like a hot knife through butter, it broke through the thin and old body and extended out from his back. His heart, which had been shattered into 5 pieces, sprayed out arrows of blood in a frightening manner under the still curtain of raindrops. Hong Xiang was already dead. No one could survive after their heart had been shattered. His body was bent. He no longer had the godlike domineering appearance that Sigajian had when he ascended the mountain. Instead, he was like a pitiful dwarf, covered in blood, hanging from Xueqi's right hand. Hong Xiang was not dead. Although his heart had been shattered and his breath was gone, the meridians in his body still maintained the state they were in before he died. All of his zhenqi was desperately being released toward heaven and earth. From the end of his meridians, it scattered into the surrounding nature. It was like a black hole. Although it was deathly still, it relied on some miraculous law and used his body and meridians as a bridge to send out, absorb, and dim. Including the arm in his body. Master Xueqi had used all of his strength in this brush. The abundant zhenqi in his body seeped out from every pore and inch of skin. Following Hong Xiang's reversal of the secret method that used his life as the price, it endlessly leaked outwards. Xueqi's eyes lit up. It was not an understanding. It was a feeling. The raindrop less than an inch in front of his eyes was still floating in the air. He already understood that he had fallen into a trap. Dong Mountain itself was a trap. Hong Xiang was not a great grandmaster. The domineering aura he had released earlier at the top of the mountain was borrowed. His realm was also borrowed. It was because it was not his own that he was able to release it with all his strength at the expense of his body and spirit. That was why it appeared particularly ruthless and did not seem to be at the level a human should have. Hong Xiang had long prepared to die. Someone wanted to use his death to absorb a bit of his zhenqi. His final brush, which relied on the mountain and water, had already sent out his zhenqi. A gap had already appeared in the protection of his body and life. That person wanted to use this gap. That person had displayed the incomparably wondrous realm through Hong Xiang. Having no time to sense the changes between the sword fanatic and Lu Yun, Master Xueqi's eyes grew brighter. Like an autumn moon, it appeared without warning in a pool of green water. His favorite female disciple, Haitang, had the cleanest and brightest eyes in the world. If compared to Xueqi's eyes, it was like comparing a firefly to a bright moon. Xueqi was the person with the most meticulous perception of his surroundings in the world. His personality was the most gentle but also the strongest. This could be seen from his trip to the temple many years ago. When he discovered that old Yunakong was a trap, his reaction followed. There was no one else in the world who could change so quickly. Perhaps it was only 1/100th of a second. He should have reacted a bit faster than the person who set the trap had imagined. But it was very likely a fatal time difference. Xueqi's eyes were as bright as the moon and as pure as the lone star. He took a deep breath. With this breath, it was as if he wanted to suck in all of the air on the peak of Dong Mountain. The old man's chest suddenly swelled up. His entire body seemed to have grown 2 inches. Following this breath, the supreme zhenqi of Tianyi Dao in his body also began to breathe from his right arm. It followed the natural inhalation and exhalation of the world, and easily broke free from the pull of the aura emanating from Hong Xiang's body. It began to use the fastest speed to circulate through his meridians. Only Tianyi Dao's peaceful method could display such a fast change so naturally. There was no difference between time and stillness. There was no time to make any movement controlled by muscles. However, The zhenqi that flowed through a person's body like mercury and light could faintly break through the limits of time and complete its mission. The zhenqi flowed back. Eunuch Hong's thin and weak body turned into a mist of blood that filled the sky but did not have time to dissipate. No one noticed that Xueqi's left hand, which hung by his side, naturally curled up a finger and drew a semicircle in the air, making a hand gesture that had never appeared on this land. Following this hand gesture, the rain that filled the sky once again paused. The faint aura that was mixed in the wind and rain on the peak of Dong Mountain and soaked in the ruins of the ancient temple poured into his body at an astonishing speed. The aura summoned by the strange hand gesture was very weak. In such a dangerous moment, a stick of firewood or a drop of water were all precious existences in a battle between grandmasters. What exactly was this hand gesture? It could actually suck in zhenqi from the empty air and the eaves of the temple? Magic. The magic that the sorcerers practiced on the other side of the ocean. Yet, it had appeared in Master Xueqi's hands. On the rain-drenched Dong Mountain, the Northern Qi Imperial Advisor Xu, he finally used his greatest trump card. He used a method that was usually of no help, but at this moment, could help him speed up the recovery of his zhenqi. When he fought against Wu Zhu, he had not used this magical treasure. But now, he used it without hesitation. In the instant that old Eunuch Hong died, before the mist of blood had time to disperse, a hand as white as jade, stretched out from the mist of blood. This scene appeared strangely strange. A hand as steady as white jade stretched out from the bloody mist. It was like a divine hand reaching out from the depths of hell to plunder all life in the world. In the instant he sensed this hand, the light in Xueqi's eyes grew brighter and brighter. His first reaction was normal. This hand should be Yi Liuyun's. Only Yi Liuyun's hand could be so steady and wondrous. However, Xueqi was not afraid. The Tiani Dao zhenqi in his body had long returned to his body. The faint yuanqi of heaven and earth summoned by a miraculous spell had also seeped into his meridians through his 36,000 pores. The zhenqi in his body had already reached its peak. With each tremble, it had reached the limit that a human could contain. If Xueqi wanted to use old Eunuch Hong's death to create an opening in his power, then Xueqi's strangely fast reaction and the magic hand gesture that no one had expected perfectly filled in this opening. In fact, it was a bit too perfect. That spotlessly white hand suddenly hid the radiance on its skin, but it appeared even more terrifying. Even in such a high-speed realm, it didn't tremble in the slightest. With an unbelievable level of stability and power, it passed through that bloody mist with incredible speed and pressed down. As it moved, the hand loosened 4 fingers. The index finger curled up slightly. The soft and firm fingertip broke the drop of rain an inch in front of Master Xueqi's eyes. It then gently landed between his brows. It was as if it was going to mark a bright red mole between his brows. The drop of rain was broken by the finger and turned into a small hollow water circle. Beautiful ripples floated around it as it slowly expanded. However, a red mole did not appear between Xueqi's brows. On the contrary, it grew brighter. It was as if all the light in Xueqi's dimming eyes had been sent to the space between his brows. Master Xueqi used the supreme zhenqi of Tiani Dao he had cultivated for decades and the yuanqi of heaven and earth he had summoned through a spell to gather between his brows and forcefully resist this beautiful finger. The slightly curled and steady index finger did not forcefully resist the pure zhenqi between his brows. Instead, it used a slow and gentle method to pour in. There was no ruthlessness, no intent to kill, and no natural aura. There was only the most upright and proper rules of the world. The way of the king. The tip of the finger moved down again. With a whoosh, it swiftly pointed out and pierced directly into Xueqi's chest. Although it was just the movement of a finger, it faintly made one feel like there was the movement of a dragon or a tiger. One finger had the dignity of an emperor. Xueqi had already pulled back his right hand. With a serious expression, he raised his thumb. Miraculously, it met the index finger and made a muffled thud. The index finger moved down again, piercing straight into Xueqi's abdomen. Xueqi lowered his eyelids. His hemp clothing swayed slightly. His flat finger became a palm. His right palm was like a trickling stream flowing with the mountain. It naturally hung down and blocked the finger in front of his abdomen. All of this proceeded as if it should be. However, Xueqi's body began to tremble violently. A red spot appeared in the center of his right palm. It sizzled like a red-hot branding iron. The steady hand only stretched out 3 fingers. These 3 fingers were not meant to kill, to destroy, or to resist. Instead, they were meant to give. They were upright and straightforward, without the slightest hint of a sneak attack. The heart and bearing of a monarch were all contained within these 3 fingers, and the aura of the Tao of Kings was completely revealed. Another bolt of lightning rang out in the sky. Xueqi's body was like a kite with its string cut. Dispiritedly and powerlessly, he flew into the distance toward the large tree beside the stone path on Dong Mountain. He sat cross-legged and sighed. Xueqi knew he had been wrong. He had been wrong from the very beginning. The most fatal mistake had happened 3 fingers ago. After he realized that Hong Xiong was a trap, his reaction speed had been too fast. His method of response had been too sufficient. He had raised his realm too perfectly. At that moment, Xueqi was like a large tree that reached into the clouds and reached the highest point in the world. He was like a lake of autumn water that had already formed a vast and mighty force. That person had only extended 3 fingers and poured about half of the Xueqi in his body into Xueqi's body. With the power of the Way of the King, a tyrannical aura was poured in. Master Xueqi, who had to endure all of this in such a short time, was like a large tree that reached into the clouds being pressed down by another giant tree. It was like the heavens had suddenly poured half a lake of autumn water into the full lake. When the water was full, it overflowed. The lake dam collapsed. The tree trunk also snapped in the middle with a crack. Compared to mortals, a great grandmaster's state of mind was close to that of a god. Xueqi was known as the person closest to a god in the world. In the end, great grandmasters had their own weaknesses. Their weakness was their physical bodies. The meridians in their bodies had a limit. There was also a limit to what the physical body could endure. The Xueqi that had been poured in by the 3 fingers had forcefully broken through Xueqi's limit. The meridians and physical body in his body had received irreparable damage. Sitting cross-legged under the tree, Xueqi felt the swelling sensation from his skin. There was still a glimmer of doubt in his heart. How could the owner of that hand be able to spit out so much Xueqi in such a short time? This was a speed that the meridians of the human body could not endure. Everything should have already ended. When Hong Xiong turned into a bloody mist, the empty sword in Sigu Jian's left hand stabbed out at a slanted angle. He stabbed empty air. He had no choice but to save Yi Luyun, but Yi Luyun did not save him at all. That ball of flowing cloud had already covered Sigu Jian's face. Sigu Jian trembled in anger and cried out wretchedly. Lowering his head, he twisted his right wrist. The sword pressed toward Yi Luyun's abdomen. The illusory sword in his left hand missed. Immediately after, he lowered his head. A weak spot finally appeared in the ruthless and harmonious sword. However, he had to dodge because he knew the situation had changed. He had to survive. Sigu Jian survived. Half of his face had been smashed to pieces by Yi Luyun's Sanzhou. Yi Luyun also survived. He lowered his head coldly and tightened his left hand around the sword, only allowing it to enter an inch into his abdomen. It was not over. Yi Luyun's Sanzhou had not ended its momentum. It cleaved down and struck Sigu Jian's shoulder with a thud. His 5 fingers were like a dragon's claw. They shot out from the cloud and sank deep into flesh and bone. It was as if Sigu Jian did not feel any pain. He pulled back his left hand and struck his wrist with it. The long sword entered another inch into Yi Luyun's abdomen. Then, the tip of the sword flashed with light. It was shattered by the powerful sword force and bloomed into a beautiful flower. This was a terrifying sword strike. Although it had encountered many unexpected problems along the way, it still relied on the ruthlessness it carried from the beginning to successfully heavily injure Yi Luyun. At this moment, the ball of bloody mist dissipated. A bright yellow figure appeared from behind the bloody mist. It seemed to hide the fact that every emperor had to use the blood of countless people to pave the foundation of his immortal empire. The bright yellow figure appeared between Yi Luyun and Sigu Jian and threw out a punch. There were no flashy moves or techniques involved. It was just a simple and clear strike. However, there was no one in the world who could throw out such a simple and clear punch. It was open and above board, yet it made it impossible for one to dodge. In fact, it was impossible to dodge. First, there was a tearing sound. His body received a powerful Xueqi attack. Sigu Jian's right arm, which had been grabbed by Yi Luyun's dragon claw, broke apart. Immediately after, there was a muffled sound like that of an ancient temple's bell. A complicated expression flashed through Sigu Jian's eyes. Looking at the bright yellow figure in front of him, his entire body was sent flying. With that expression, Jian flew with his broken arm and smashed through the wooden door of Dongshan Qing Temple. The powerful force smashed through countless structures in the ancient temple. Like a large boulder, he crushed everything his body came into contact with. In the end, he crashed into the large bell in the small ancestral hall in the depths of the ancient temple and made a ringing sound. On the opposite side of the ancient temple, under a large tree by the stone path, Xueqi, dressed in hemp clothing, watched this scene with a perplexed expression. He sat cross-legged. It was as if he had been triggered by the sound of the bell. Something in his body suddenly exploded. Immediately after, it shrank. Fresh blood seeped out of his eyes and ears. The large tree behind Xueqi collapsed with a rumble and shattered into pieces. The stones within a 5-foot radius around him were all squeezed into three-dimensional surfaces by the zhenqi that exploded out of his body. They were either ferocious or sorrowful as they raised their sharp corners to welcome the last of the rain from the heavens. Most of the buildings in the old temple of Qing had become ruins. The ancient myths and legends painted in oil had become powdered memories of the past. The moss-covered pool was missing a large opening, and the rainwater inside flowed out, mixing with the soil and stones and becoming murky. A few white cranes, stunned by the commotion, cowered timidly behind the pool. A yellow cloth fell to the ground, covering Jian's body lying on the ground at the end of the wretched passageway. Only Jian's weak voice could be heard under the yellow cloth, wretchedly cursing something. However, his voice was already very weak. It was completely covered up by the sound of the bell above his head. The buzzing sound of the bell rang through the entire summit of Dong Mountain. The hurricane by the seaside came quickly and left quickly, just like the impermanence of the world and the happiness and anger of emperors. Earlier, there had been a violent storm. Suddenly, the wind and rain stopped. The dark clouds in the sky abruptly parted to reveal a gentle porcelain blue sky behind the clouds. A ray of light shone down clearly and landed on the bright yellow figure by the cliff of Dong Mountain, illuminating his face clearly. The Qing emperor stood where he was with a pale face. His 4 limbs were trembling. Half of the tyrannical zhenqi in his body had been poured into Xueqi's body. The last fist of the way of the emperor had squeezed out the last of his spirit. He was extremely tired. The light of the sky was faint. The most powerful ruler in the world had his dragon robe drenched by the rain. His hair was also messy and hung weakly on his forehead. The calmness in his eyes contained countless emotions that could not be understood. In his life, he had never been so wretched. In his life, he had never been so powerful. I hope everyone is satisfied. I need everyone's monthly votes to encourage me. I've done my best. I'm satisfied. Today's chapter will be later because I have to do my best. This is like the archery championship earlier. As long as I do my best, I will win. Thank you. I'm very tired. Chapter 577. On the shore of the ocean, on Dong Mountain, the umpteenth hurricane in the 7th year of the Qing calendar stopped without a sound. In the following period of time, this hurricane would bring rare rainwater to the Qing kingdom, which was already showing signs of a slight drought. Furthermore, it was very gentle and did not cause too great a disaster. After the attack of the storm, the old eaves of the old temple on the mountaintop had become a pile of ruins. The ground was covered in rubble. Mud and stone flew everywhere. It was a tragic sight to behold. The rainwater first washed over it and then quickly flowed down the mountain, forming sections of pure white waterfalls on the jade-like precipices. Occasionally, there was a sliver of a faint blood-red color in the waterfalls. On the contrary, the mountaintop gradually became clean. There wasn't even a trace of the smell of blood left. Was such a scene created by the might of heaven or the Grand Master's world-shaking battle? In reality, it was the might of heaven. The sky above the summit of Dong Mountain had gradually revealed its true appearance. The thick black clouds were blown away by the strong wind. At a speed visible to the naked eye, they quickly moved toward the sky inland in the west. A bright and clear light once again descended on the summit of the mountain, and onto the body of the most powerful man in the world by the precipice. He was the most powerful person in the world, bar none. No one dared to call him by his name because he was the emperor of the most powerful Qing kingdom. He was a famous general who had led an army on 3 northern expeditions, forcefully breaking the Wei kingdom into pieces, and completely changing the shape of the world's territories. He was the schemer who used the emperor's schemes the most thoroughly, the most tolerant, and the most tenacious. Just these 3 identities were enough for him to be called the most powerful person in the world. Furthermore, at the end of the Dong Mountain killing situation, his last identity was revealed. The most mysterious of the 4 great grandmasters in the world, the strange creature rumored to have always guarded the Qing palace and not come out. Sigu Jian had entered Jingdo alone but had been forced back by the tyrannical power released by the royal palace, thus indirectly proving his existence. It was the emperor of the Qing kingdom. This was the emperor's final trump card. Fan Xian had once been puzzled. Just what kind of foundation was the emperor's powerful self-confidence and natural bearing built on? Many people were guessing at the emperor's trump card. In the last moment, Fan Xian guessed that it was the Yi family, but he would never have guessed that this flipped trump card had the word Grandmaster written on it. Hong Xixiang was just a cover, a flagpole sticking out from the back of the palace, gently swaying in the dark wind of the night, attracting the attention of all the wise men. Without a doubt, this old eunuch was one of the strongest in the world. Otherwise, he would not have been able to kill the Hu assassin in the floating temple with one palm. However, it was difficult for an abnormal person to reach the peak of the heavenly path. In order to kill Ku He and Sigu Jian in one fell swoop, the Qing emperor and eunuch Hong had worked painstakingly and cautiously for a full 20 years. Old eunuch Hong had already gloriously completed his mission of 20 years and turned into a bloody mist that filled the sky. Washed by the torrential rain and washed by the cool wind, it entered the white waterfall and fell into the East Sea. It entered the moist air of the forest and moistened the earth. His life essence, blood, and flesh all merged into the beautiful landscape of the Qing kingdom and could no longer be separated. Looking at the middle-aged man in the bright yellow dragon robe, the people present who had luckily survived all sank into a boundless shock. Everyone's throat seemed to be pinched by an invisible hand, unable to make a single sound. Without question, the truth that had unfolded on the peak of Dong Mountain was the most shocking and world-shaking news since the sudden death of Lady Yi 20 years ago. The ringing of the bell coming from the ruins of the ancient temple gradually grew weaker and calmed down. Beside the roots of the large tree that had already been shattered into countless pieces of bark, the Northern Qi imperial advisor Ku He, dressed in tattered hemp clothing, looked calmly at the Qing emperor at the edge of the cliff with a clear gaze in his eyes. The ruthless and tyrannical Xueqi in his body finally calmed down as the ringing of the bell stopped. He knew that his internal organs and 13 meridians had already been invaded into a chaotic mess by this Xueqi. Even the temple would not be able to save him. After understanding reality, he immediately accepted it. His dignity and state of mind as a great grandmaster made Ku He's expression very calm. He looked at the Qing emperor and gently sighed. His eyes had already seen through everything. Everyone had lost. They had lost to the other party's 20 years of enduring and disguise. This was a terrifying and respectable opponent. To be able to endure for so long and not let anyone catch wind of it, this made Ku He feel even more respect than the shocking truth that the Qing emperor was a great grandmaster. Ku He couldn't help but think of the numerous conversations he had with the Empress Dowager and the emperor before he left Shangjing. At that time, his grandson had a bad omen. However, Ku He had still floated over because he and Sigu Jian had made ample preparations. These 2 great grandmasters had not anticipated that the emperor would make a move. Every trick and scheme has ended up costing you your life. Ku He sighed gently. A smile of knowing his destiny rose to his face. Involuntarily, he quietly spat out a sentence that the child had recorded in a book. In terms of tenacity and endurance, of the millions of people in this world, there was no one with a heart stronger than the Qing emperors. Although he felt a glimmer of worry for his home, Ku He did not feel any regret losing to such an opponent. In the instant the emperor made his move, Wu Zhu tightened his grip on the metal drill and immediately put it down. Having done this 3 times, he finally let go of the metal drill and placed his hands behind his back. The black cloth on his face fluttered in the wind and rain of Dong Mountain. During the Grandmaster's battle, everyone on the mountaintop knelt on the ground and used the trembling of their bodies to express their respect. Only he stood coldly and even somewhat woodenly, watching all of this from the sidelines. Ku He sat under the tree while Sigu Jian rang the bell. Wu Zhu tilted his head slightly. On his usually expressionless face, the corners of his lips couldn't help but twitch. The fact that the emperor was a great grandmaster would certainly shock the entire world. However, Wu Zhu still only tilted his head and looked calmly at the emperor through the black cloth like he was looking at a strange object. He did not look at him like he was the sun in the sky. In this instant, Wu Zhu seemed to remember something but seemed to immediately forget it. His brows furrowed in a rare moment as he remembered something Chen Pingping had once said. After the assassination in the Hanging Temple, Chen Pingping had smiled and said he was going to let Wu Zhu watch a show. In the end, he did not see it. What show? A show of the emperor transforming into a great grandmaster? It looked like the secret that no one in the world knew had still been somewhat guessed by the old cripple closest to the emperor. But, why did he have Wu Zhu put on this show? Wu Zhu began to think. He had many things he wanted to ask the emperor, but, for a moment, he didn't know where to start. He had so many thoughts that he couldn't pull out a thread. Furthermore, Dong Mountain was not truly calm. Although Ku He and Sigu Jian had been heavily injured, they were not dead. Given the emperor's personality, since he had revealed his final trump card, he would not leave anything behind. Thus, Wu Zhu broke off his thoughts and took a gentle step forward. His step made everyone present feel a glimmer of fear and alarm. Although no one knew who this mysterious black-clothed figure was, the attitudes of the great grandmasters earlier had already made it clear that he was also a grandmaster ace. In the current situation, if he suddenly attacked, the 4 great grandmasters, including the emperor, would probably all fall into pools of blood. Wu Zhu did not attack. He only looked calmly at the emperor. The real movement came from the depths of the ancient temple, at the end of the ruins, where the yellow cloth covering Sigu Jian suddenly moved. It was as if someone was trying to stand up under the yellow cloth. After losing an arm and suffering from the way of the emperor's punch, could Sigu Jian still stand up? Had a great grandmaster's body truly surpassed the limits of mortals? The emperor narrowed his eyes and looked in that direction. Everyone followed the emperor's gaze and looked in that direction. Ku He was no exception. However, the imperial advisor only smiled bitterly. The yellow cloth was forcefully torn apart. A young man covered in blood crawled out from under the cloth. As he coughed, he tore the yellow cloth into strips. His face was determined and calm. Although it was covered in blood, there was not a glimmer of panic. Although he coughed endlessly, he did not stop the movements of his hands. There were so many eyes on the summit of Dong Mountain, particularly powerful figures who far surpassed mortals, staring at him. However, it was as if he could not feel them at all. He only lowered his head and moved. He was not Sigu Jian. He was Sigu Jian's last disciple, 13th Wang. Once 13th Wang set his mind on something, he would do it. He had never cared what other people thought or how they would stop him. Thus, as a disciple of the Sword Hut, he had accepted Fan Xian's orders and resisted the rebel army at the mountain gate. He had been sent flying dozens of feet by Yi Lu Yun, but he still bravely climbed to the summit. He was prepared to continue completing his mission when he saw his teacher's right arm cut off and fall to the ground. Thus, he stood out and tore apart the yellow cloth strips. He carried his heavily injured teacher on his back and used the strips of cloth to bind him tightly. With a crack, his right hand chopped off a thin beam on the ground. Holding it in his hand, he walked out of the door of the old temple and faced everyone on the summit. Sigu Jian lay on his disciple's body. A large, wretched hole had been punched through his abdomen. Fresh blood poured out and landed on 13th Wang's body. Immediately after, it dripped to the ground. There was a mournful smile on his face, but there was incomparable joy in it. He was on the body of his favorite disciple. 13th Wang, covered in blood, carried his blood-covered teacher. In an instant, the yellow cloth strips were dyed bright red. He held the thin beam in his hand. There was not a glimmer of fear on his face. He only stared fiercely at the middle-aged man in dragon robes. His meaning was simple. He wanted to carry Sigu Jian down the mountain. Who would stop him? In the mouths of the storytellers of later generations, the battle on Dong Mountain that shocked the world and affected future generations was filled with too many strange changes and killings. The people who participated in this matter were all the most respected figures in the world. Thus, when they talked about it, they were particularly excited. Often, they couldn't finish talking for 3 days and 3 nights. However, what they talked about in these 3 days and 3 nights was basically what happened in 1 second. In this second, the Qing Emperor suddenly attacked, Yi Lu Yun was heavily injured, and Ku He and Sigu Jian had no way out. All of the storytellers had forgotten a relatively minor character, 13th Wang. For one, they didn't know the truth of the end of the Dong Mountain battle. For another, compared to these great grandmasters, 13th Wang was an unremarkable character. Although the Qing Emperor had used up a great deal of vital energy, given his great grandmaster realm, If he wanted to kill 13th Wang, it would be as easy as lifting a hand. However, 13th Wang, this minor character, was still not afraid. He stared viciously into the Qing Emperor's eyes as he gripped the thin beam tightly in his hand. It was as if in the next moment, he was going to use the wooden stick he had picked up on the ground to give the Qing Emperor a shock. Yi Lu Yun, with a large wound in his abdomen, sat cross-legged not far from the Qing Emperor's side, circulating his qi to heal. Looking at this scene, he couldn't help the glimmer of a smile full of admiration appearing at the corners of his lips. He sighed and said, "What a young man." Sitting cross-legged beside the broken tree, Xueqi's bitter smile gradually became clear. No one knew if he was thinking of his true last disciple, Begonia Duo, who was naturally in harmony with nature. He smiled slightly and sighed in admiration. Talented people appear in every generation, and the way of heaven changes. This is the principle. The Qing Emperor looked calmly at the unfamiliar young man. A moment later, he smiled slightly. Then, he gently moved a step to the side and opened up a path for 13th Wang, who was carrying Sigu Jian on his back. As an emperor and a great grandmaster, he opened up a path for 13th Wang. The dying Sigu Jian opened his eyes with great difficulty and glanced at the emperor. Some blood seeped out of his lips. The ruthlessness in his weak voice was still there. "How is my disciple?" "Teacher, don't talk anymore." 13th Wang coaxed his teacher like he was a child. He did not immediately choose to go down the mountain after the Qing Emperor unexpectedly opened up a path. Instead, under everyone's shocked gazes, he walked to the Qing Emperor's side, lowered his body, and picked up something. He picked it up naturally as if the Qing Emperor, who was shining brightly, did not exist. What he picked up was Sigu Jian's severed right arm and the normal sword. 13th Wang carried Sigu Jian on his back. In one hand, he held a severed arm and a sword. In the other, he used a thin beam as his usual green banner. Just like this, he disappeared from the stone path of Dong Mountain. A moment later, the faint sound of Sigu Jian's wild singing and wailing, as well as a ruthless and sorrowful laughter, echoed through the mountain valley and did not stop for a long time. The emperor could kill 13th Wang and not do anything. It was not because he valued talent. Rather, it was because he knew the relationship between this young man and Sigu Jian laughed and cried. How could he not know this? A dying great-grandmaster, in his last moment, still wanted to see if the Qing Emperor would make any mistakes. The emperor had not made any mistakes. There was no need for him to destroy Dongyi's future ahead of time and separate himself from the Qing kingdom's future. Although 13th Wang's determined state of mind moved him, he still did not think much of this young man. He was as confident as ever, arrogant and confident. After today, no one dared to disrespect this confidence. The emperor knew that Sigu Jian was dead for sure. He knew what kind of damage a full-powered punch of the way of the emperor would bring. Even if Sigu Jian could linger on for a while, what did a bedridden great-grandmaster with a severed arm count for? Of course, this was still not enough to explain why he would move out of the way. Given his personality, all enemies should be eliminated at the best opportunity. Fan Xian was also not the true reason he was considering. The true reason the emperor did not attack was because Wu Zhu had taken a step forward. Sigu Jian left. Xueqi also left. He floated away. The imperial advisor of Northern Qi floated away to his homeland and painfully waited for the last few days of his life to be tormented. After this battle, 2 of the 4 great grandmasters in the world were gone. The power balance between the 3 powers had finally undergone an earth-shattering change. The biggest obstacle to the Qing kingdom unifying the world would no longer exist. It was not until he had also left the summit of Dong Mountain did Wu Zhu slowly pull back his foot that had stepped forward and his silent threat. In the entire world, only Wu Zhu dared to threaten the Qing emperor at such a time. The Qing emperor looked at him calmly and warmly and said, "Lao Wu, I need an explanation from you." In front of Wu Zhu, the emperor naturally referred to him as Lao Wu and didn't refer to himself as emperor. Wu Zhu slowly lowered his head. A moment later he said, "I don't like it." This blind great-grandmaster had been recovering on the summit of Dong Mountain for over a year. He seemed to have remembered something. He became more and more talkative, and his expressions became more and more colorful. He was becoming more and more like a normal person. He also began to have emotions that a normal person should have, such as like and dislike. However, his emotions were rather extreme and did not match the coldness on his face. If he didn't like it, then he didn't like it. Who cared about unifying the world? Who cared about the shocking situation you spent 20 years building? If he didn't like it, then don't do it. Young master told me to protect your safety. Wu Zhu raised his head and looked at the emperor through the black cloth. You are safe now. It had been some time since he had called Fan young master. The Qing emperor's expression was calm. There was not a glimmer of anger. He knew that when Lao Wu and Yi Qingmei were in Dongyi, he had some old friendship with Sigu Jian. As for Ku He, he also knew that the young lady of the Fan family was still under Ku He's tutelage. However, those two great grandmasters were already crippled and about to die. The Qing emperor was not worried about anything. Calmly he looked at Wu Zhu and said, Lao Wu, come back to Jingdo with me. Wu Zhu lowered his head and thought for a moment. A moment later, he raised it and said, I remember some things, but I don't remember that person was you. That person was the person who had practiced the upper and lower scrolls of the nameless martial secret. When Fan Xian was young, Wu Zhu had once told him about it. However, he didn't remember who had practiced it. Only now did he remember that it was the Qing emperor. The black cloth on Wu Zhu's face appeared particularly straight. Goodbye. Wu Zhu said this last goodbye to Yi Lu Yun, who was sitting cross-legged and healing. After saying this, he gripped the metal drill at his waist with one hand and calmly walked toward the stone steps, beginning to descend the mountain. He didn't say another word to the emperor. He also didn't express farewell to the old temple he had lived in for more than a year. He once again disappeared from the stone steps. Everyone had left. Only the emperor stood alone on the summit of the mountain. Ku He and Sigu Jian were certain to die today. The plan of many years had been realized. His grand ambition to unify the world was about to begin. However, there was not much joy on the emperor's face. He just stood quietly and welcomed the sun in the sky and the slightly damp sea breeze. He appeared somewhat lonely and desolate. It was lonely to be at the top. It was difficult to find someone who could stand shoulder to shoulder with him. Regardless of who it was, in this instant, they would all feel a strange emotion. However, this kind of emotion did not last long. There were many people who had survived on the summit. Most of the officials who had come to worship heaven were still alive. More than half of the priests in the Qing temple had survived. Although the battle between the great masters was incomparably mysterious, it was strangely controlled within a perfect boundary, other than the last punch and the temples that had been crushed. Only now did the people on the summit shake off their shock. Given their eyesight, it was impossible for them to see clearly what had happened in that instant. Why was Sigu Jian's sword just about to pierce into the emperor's body when immediately after, Sigu Jian's body was sent flying back like a piece of useless rock? However, they at least knew one truth. The emperor had won. Furthermore, he had won unusually thoroughly. In front of the emperor's power, all schemes and tricks appeared weak and fragile. The future of the Qing kingdom would be like the red sun in the sky above the summit, never sinking. Their faces carried tears and ecstasy as they knelt to the ground and cried out, "Long live!" Amidst the cries, the emperor was calm. His expression did not change at all. To eunuch Yao, who was the first to stand, he quietly said, "Inform the foot of the mountain to begin, to act. Inform the director to begin." Yes. Send a secret edict to Yanjing. Order Mei Zhili to temporarily act as regent. Order the western camp to press toward the Song border. Order General Shi Fei to bring the edict earlier to the northern expedition camp in Songzhou to take over the northern expedition army. Yes. Inform Xueqi to select a number of able officials to go to Luozhou. Tell him that I will wait for him in Ho Yongji's manor. Yes. The emperor had not lost his head at all from today's great victory. Instead, he calmly gave out order after order. The news to Chen Pingping had to be the earliest and the northern expedition army had to be controlled. As for Dongshan Road, as eunuch Yao lowered his head in acknowledgement, he felt a chill in his heart. It was impossible for Dongshan Road not to know about such a dangerous matter as surrounding Dong Mountain. Governor Ho had probably long colluded with the eldest princess. It looked like the first governor to die a violent death since the founding of the Qing kingdom was going to fall on Ho Yongji's shoulders. All of Dongshan Road was probably going to be bathed in blood from top to bottom by the emperor. No wonder the emperor had Xueqi travel thousands of li from Jiangnan to send good officials. After calmly and methodically setting up all of this, the Qing emperor finally let out a slow breath. He smiled self-mockingly and shook his head. He then walked in front of Yi Luyun and bowed respectfully. "Thank you for your hard work, Uncle Luyun." Without waiting for Yi Luyun to return the bow, he had already straightened his body and gazed in a daze at the ground that had long been washed clean. Hong Xixiang had died there, but he had not left any traces. For the sake of a noble goal, many people had willingly or passively given up their lives. Eunuch Hong was worthy of the Qing Emperor's bow. The scene was a mess. However, the internal court had prepared a lot of things. Eunuch Yao led the officials whose legs were still weak and moved out some things from a side room that had never collapsed. He began to copy and stamp the seal. The Emperor's royal seal had already been taken away by Sir Fan Jr., but the Emperor's personal seal was still there. Since it was a secret edict, the personal seal was even more effective. After the first wash of the heavy rain, Dong Mountain welcomed the sun. A few white pigeons flew away from the summit of the mountain and circled a few times in the blue sky before flying off in all directions of the Qing kingdom. What they brought was not the news of the flood receding or the will of peace. Instead, it was the transmission of a powerful ruler's will. The flat summit of Dong Mountain had been calm until now. Suddenly, a massive rumble rang out. It didn't shake up any sand or stone, but it did raise some splashes of water. The entire area in the middle of the summit sunk 3 feet. It was as if a god had dropped a hammer and struck it. Only now did the true effect of a battle between great grandmasters reveal its terror and terror. As the two forces intersected, the compressed vital energy seeped into the world and forcefully collided with nature, changing the shape of the land. The emperor didn't look at the large pit. He only raised his head and watched the white pigeons fly in the sky and gradually fly further and further away. His expression was calm and incomparably confident. Chapter 578. The Emperor issued a few secret edicts in succession. He then furrowed his brows and said something in a low voice to Eunuch Yao. Eunuch Yao was slightly startled, but his head was lowered very low, terrified of revealing even the slightest inappropriate emotion. The Qing Emperor had used himself as bait to kill the 2 great grandmasters in the Dong Mountain situation. Naturally, he was prepared for everything that happened under heaven, such as the 5,000 rebel soldiers at the foot of Dong Mountain and the rebellion that was about to happen in Jingdo. Since the eldest princess had the power to create such a large situation, she would not pass up the opportunity to control the Qing kingdom in one go. This opportunity was bestowed upon her by the emperor. Once the situation developed, if he wanted the Qing kingdom to maintain a stable development, it seemed that the emperor, far away in Dong Mountain, could only rush back to Jingdo and use his supreme authority to stabilize the situation in Jingdo. The emperor had long ambushed provincial soldiers in Jiangbei. It did not involve the movements of the Bureau of Military Affairs. It was all planned in secret with Xueqi and the governor of Jiangbei Road. Naturally, it would not disturb the power of the Qin family. With such an ambush army, how could the 5,000 rebel soldiers at the foot of Dong Mountain be enough? All of the conspirators saw the emperor as a fierce tiger in a trap. They did not think that this fierce tiger had actually been standing by the side of the trap the entire time, watching coldly as the hunters lost their footing. If the Qing emperor wanted to rush back to Jingdo and forcefully suppress the internal chaos, it would not be difficult. However, when the emperor and Chen Pingping had spoken twice by the palace pillars in front of the royal study and decided on this plan, he had never thought that once he finished the Dong Mountain matter, he would use the army to sweep through Dongshan Road and then return to court to tidy up state affairs. Although the Dong Mountain matter had happened by the seaside, its effects had spread throughout the entire Qing kingdom. For him, this was a rare opportunity. After a long period of planning, the main goal of the Dong Mountain matter was to remove the 2 biggest obstacles to the Qing kingdom's unification of the world. This was the so-called external threat. However, the external threat had been removed. What about the internal threat? This was an opportunity for the emperor. He would use his death to lure out all the restless elements in the court. Once the officials, who usually appeared to be incomparably loyal to him, knew of his death, would they still follow his final edict? Would they still have any respect for him? Would the little person hidden in the darkness and fog jump out now? Just as the emperor had always emphasized to Fan Xian and his sons, he valued people's hearts. The situation in Jingdo was, without question, the best opportunity to test people's hearts. The emperor stood in front of Yi Luyun, who was sitting cross-legged and healing. His expression was calm, but there were slight wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. What he said to Eunuch Yao was simple. He was going to send an edict to Chen Pingping to seal off the news. These were the two people the emperor trusted the most. The emperor wanted to see them one last time. Once Fan Xian and Yi Zhong passed the psychological test, they would obtain his absolute trust. However, the emperor on the peak of Dong Mountain had truly not thought that the situation in Jingdo would be so dangerous, that the people in the palace would be so hurt, and that his sister would be so powerful. Yi Luyun sighed and quietly said, "If we don't hurry back to Jingdo, I'm afraid there will be great chaos." In order to achieve great governance, there must first be great chaos. Using a storm of blood and wind to wash out the gold from the yellow sand and forge a united, iron-like Qing kingdom could lay a good foundation for the war to unify the land in 2 or 3 years. The Qing emperor did not think much of such a price. However, he also did not underestimate his sister. He knew that if this happened, the entire Qing kingdom would probably sink into a storm. "I fought for this land," the emperor said coldly. "Even if Yun Rui sits firmly in Jingdo, I can still fight back." After these words were said, the emperor didn't say anything more. After coughing, he slowly walked toward the blood-stained mountain gate at the foot of Dong Mountain with Eunuch Yao's support. The signal arrow had already been raised. The sounds of killing rang out again at the foot of the mountain. The officials and attendants accompanying the heaven worship came down the mountain with faces full of fear. A number of people had already made a stretcher. Humbly, they helped Yi Luyun lie down. The transmission of information in this era was unusually slow. Chen Pingping, far away in Jingdo, had already arranged everything. The Overwatch Council was powerful enough to seal off any true information from Dong Mountain Road. The emperor had calculated that at the beginning of the rebellion, his proud and crazy sister would send news of his death back to Jingdo and push the entire situation into a crazy situation from which there was no way to recover. Since the eldest princess had started the Dong Mountain incident, regardless of whether the emperor was alive or dead, she had to handle all matters in Jingdo with the mentality that the emperor was already dead. This was the madness of staking everything on one throw. However, Ku He and Sigu Jian were still alive. The 5,000 rebel soldiers at the foot of the mountain and the Jiaozhou Navy rebel army on the sea could not be completely destroyed. At most, in another 7 days, the true situation at Dong Mountain would get out. Given the distance between the two places and the Overwatch Council's ability to seal off information along the way, in about 30 days, the people of Jingdo would know of this earth-shattering news. At that time, the eldest princess would presumably have already started for a dozen days. No one knew if Jingdo could be held. As the emperor walked silently down the mountain, he thought about all of this. Although he was confident, he still did not want his Jingdo or his Qing kingdom to see too much turmoil. Comparing the two, he was still willing to take a risk and see the sincerity hidden in the deepest parts of people. He wanted to see the power of people, particularly Fan Xian's. He wanted to see whether or not Fan Xian could understand the heart of a monarch and help the emperor guard his homeland. He had not thought that Fan Xian would fight a beautiful battle but be restrained by the eldest princess with even more beautiful methods. In the end, Fan Xian had guessed the emperor's thoughts. However, the methods he used to protect his Jingdo home were things the emperor had never expected or wanted to see. No matter how the emperor calculated, he still missed one thing. It was the Empress Dowager's attitude. This emperor, famous for his filial piety and known to rule the world through filial piety, had forgotten that his mother was actually like him. She would forever place the Qing kingdom and the survival of the royal family first. Other than his own life, it was more important. Before he went down the mountain, the emperor, who had just obtained the greatest success of his life, still calmly gave one last order: capture alive the leader of the rebel army at the foot of the mountain. Although the black-clothed man at the foot of the mountain was not a great grandmaster, he was another important figure in the Qing emperor's heart. Wang Qinian lowered his head and fled down the mountain through the dense forest in the wind and rain. Before Ku He's first palm landed on old Eunuch Hong's chest, this Overwatch Council official, who had seen the opportunity quickly, had secretly slipped down the mountain while no one was paying attention. He was known as the Two Wings of the Overwatch Council. Back then, he had been a great bandit who had swept through Dongyi and northern Qi. When he did this kind of sneaky action, it was truly sharp. The sharp edges of the leaves brushed past his body. Although they were unable to cut through the Overwatch Council's special robes, they still shocked him. He didn't know what would happen at the top of the mountain. He only knew that such a scene was not something someone of his level should be prying into or curious about. In his opinion, the emperor was dead for sure. No one could survive the combined attack of 3 great grandmasters. Thus, he decided to flee at the first opportunity. His thoughts were simple. He had to send this shocking news to Jingdo at the first opportunity. Although he didn't know if he would be able to run into Fan Xian, who was also fleeing, he had to at least notify Director Chen. Jumping over a call, he cautiously used the wind, rain, and trees as cover. He had already come to the middle of the mountain without a sound. At this moment, he heard a muffled sound at the top of the mountain followed by the sound of a bell. It was the moment the Qing Emperor had punched out with the way of the Emperor's killing fist and Sigu Jian's heavily injured body crashed into the ancient temple's bronze bell. Wang Qinian paused and continued to lower his head. He hadn't walked for long when he felt some movement behind him. Unconsciously, he hid his body in a pile of weeds and watched the slanted stone path in the distance. 2 bloody people walked down the stone path. Wang Qinian was familiar with the young man. It was 13th Wang, whom he had interacted with for a long time in Jiangnan. Who was on his back? Wang Qinian's eyes widened. Listening to the weak but comical conversation between the 2 bloody people, he finally knew who 13th Wang was carrying. The bloody person with the broken arm was 13th Wang's teacher. Wang Qinian was Fan Xian's most trusted aide. He even knew about the matter of the chest. Naturally, he also knew 13th Wang's true identity. 13th Wang was the last disciple of Dongyi's Sigu Jian. Then, his teacher was Sigu Jian. Wang Qinian's shocked pupils constricted. He didn't even dare to breathe loudly. He could only calmly watch this strange and sorrowful pair of teacher and disciple walk down the stone steps step by step. A moment later, he came back to his senses. He was still slightly absent-minded. He wondered what had happened on the summit of the mountain. Who in this world could injure Sigu Jian to such an extent? Before Wang Qinian could wake up from his shock, a hemp-clothed figure floated down the mountain in a strange posture. Wang Qinian looked at this scene and almost vomited blood. What was going on with Master Ku He? Magic. Looking at this old bald donkey's face, why was it like a zombie's? 2 great grandmasters had walked past Wang Qinian's eyes one after another. Furthermore, they had left in such a dejected manner. Perhaps they had already discovered Wang Qinian's hiding like a field mouse. At this moment, how could the 2 great grandmasters who didn't have long to live have the energy to pay attention to him? However, Wang Qinian was extremely shocked. He couldn't understand how the 2 grandmasters, who had charged to the top of East Mountain like gods, could become like this in such a short time. After a long time, he straightened his body with trembling legs and turned his head toward the peak of Dong Mountain that rose into the clouds. He thought to himself, had the emperor won? Perhaps he should return to the summit of the mountain to see what had happened. However, the shock in his heart and a faint sense of fear urged his legs to continue walking down the mountain. Past noon and into the night, the sounds of killing rose up from all directions at the foot of the mountain. Wang Qinian, who had been hiding in the darkness like a bat, finally took the opportunity to break out of the battlefield. He finally confirmed the reality that the emperor was still alive and well. The rebellion had failed. The great grandmasters were doomed. He made a decision on his own. He would no longer follow the heaven worship procession. Instead, he ran toward Jingdo as fast as he could. He had to tell Fan Xian the truth of this matter and provide background information that Sir Fan Jr. could use for reference. Only then could he prevent Fan Xian from making an unforgivable mistake in Jingdo. Wang Qinian was an official of the Overwatch Council and an official of the Emperor. He was certain of only one identity. He was Fan Xian's trusted aide. He knew too many things about Fan Xian and too many thoughts. He was very afraid that Fan Xian would make some wrong decisions because of the Emperor's death. It was just like how the Jiaozhou Navy Admiral Su Maokai had advised Fan Xian to make a decision on the boat. For some reason, Wang Qinian guessed the Emperor's thoughts. He was terrified and worried for Fan Xian and everyone in Jingdo. Thus, he used the fastest speed and experienced countless twists and turns to rush back to Jingdo. He rushed ahead of the Overwatch Council and the eldest princess spies. Carrying this world-shaking news, he came to Chen Garden. He was the first person in the world to spread this news. In the end, he did not spread this news. The old cripple of the Overwatch Council had directly tied him up and gagged his mouth, not giving him any chance to spread the news. In the few days after the old cripple learned of the situation on Dong Mountain, he developed a new habit. He often sighed to his old servant. You have to know that it is not an easy thing to make a person die. When Wang Qinian prepared to slip down the mountaintop, Gao De had already slipped away. These trusted aides at Fan Xian's side had, without question, been infected with too much of Fan Xian's scent. They were different from most people in this world. In the depths of their hearts, they had already unconsciously begun to view their own lives as more important than the emperor's. In a society with imperial power, this was a rebellious thought. Although Fan Xian had never said it explicitly, the way he did things in secret from the court and the imperceptible influence he had on the words and actions of the people at his side all showed this point. When Gao De trembled as he fled down the mountain, he had certainly not thought of this. Like Wang Qinian, he did not see Sigu Jian and Ku He's heavily injured figures. However, he had discovered the truth of the matter at the foot of the mountain. He was afraid and terrified because his and Wang Qinian's identities were different. The officials of the Overwatch Council were the emperor's subjects, while the Tiger Guards were the emperor's servants, or perhaps, the last layer of protection. Wang Qinian could run, but the Tiger Guards could not, particularly when the emperor's life was in danger. For the Tiger Guards, fleeing in the face of battle was a kind of humiliation and a monstrous crime. Perhaps Gao De could lessen the feeling of humiliation in his heart, but he could not avoid this crime. The stone path was covered with the bodies of the Tiger Guards and shattered blades. All of his colleagues had died on Dong Mountain. When he faintly understood the result of the assassination at the mountaintop, Gao De became angry, hurt, and afraid. 100 Tiger Guards had died just like that. When had the emperor ever cared about their lives? Gao De's heart was cold. He knew that he would never be able to return to the emperor's side. Once he showed himself, what awaited him would be the severe punishment of the Qing law and palace rules. Not only would he die, but perhaps even his family would be implicated. Thus, he chose to flee even more resolutely. He trusted Fan Xian, but he could not return to Fan Xian's side because he didn't want to bring any trouble to Sir Fan Jr. He only wanted to leave the unfathomable royal palace and the emperor whose power could not be offended. He wanted to go to a distant place and live the rest of his life in peace. At the end of the Dong Mountain incident, 2 of Fan Xian's trusted aides chose their own paths. At the time, it did not attract much attention. No one had even noticed this. But when it came to things like life, who could say anything about it? Every sip and every peck was destined. The cause sown today would bear a bitter fruit in the future. While Gao De and Wang Qinian were running on the road, the thousands of rebel soldiers at the foot of Dong Mountain and the 9th-level assassins in Dongyi were also on the road to escape. The Jiaozhou Navy ships on the sea had not yet entered the deep ocean when they were blocked off by the ships that Xiaozhou had sent over. Although the combined fighting power of the 2 provincial soldiers was far from that of Yan Xiaoyi's personal longbow soldiers, the most important thing in a battle between 2 armies was momentum. Ku He and Sigu Jian, 2 figures who were like gods in the hearts of common soldiers, had both met such a tragic end. What would these rebel soldiers, who had betrayed the emperor, think? When the emperor, wearing a bright yellow dragon robe, and Yilu Yun, who had been the protector of the Qing kingdom for decades, walked out of the mountain and appeared in front of the rebel soldiers, this rebellion had already come to an end. The military had not moved, but their morale had already been defeated. Thousands of rebel soldiers stood at the foot of Dong Mountain in fear and helplessness. The roads leading to the wilderness had already been surrounded by layers of provincial soldiers who had come on orders. They knew they had no way out, but they could not summon up the last of their courage to carry out the last struggle of their lives. His Majesty's words shattered everything they had. I will pardon you all from the death penalty. Regardless of whether they believed it or not, this was still a sweet, poisonous fruit. The rebel army abandoned their weapons and surrendered, but it was unknown how they would be massacred and cleansed in the next 2 years. When the provincial soldiers began to surround them, before the Qing emperor had come down the mountain, the Qing emperor had not yet come down the mountain. After attacking the mountain, Yun Jilan and a group of Dongyi assassins still had a dozen people left. They received Sigu Jian, who 13th Wang had bravely carried down from the mountain. Knowing the truth at the summit, they broke away from the rebel army with chills all over their bodies and began to kill their way into the woods in the north. Such a group indeed had a powerful killing power. They successfully broke through the perimeter and entered the secret mountain paths that used to be Danzhou. The Qing emperor was a person, not a god. Even if he could calculate everything, in order to give the eldest princess a chance and for the bigger picture, he could not take care of everything. There were too many cracks appearing within the Qing kingdom. It was a foolish dream to want to wipe out all the opposing forces in one fell swoop. He was not surprised by Dongyi's breakthrough. However, the Qing Emperor had given an order to the black-clothed commander of the rebel army because he was very interested in him. Even though he knew the chances of capturing him were not high, he still had to try. Master Xueqi, with an inauspicious yellow face, was sitting behind the black-clothed man's horse and following him out of the encirclement. For a grandmaster to be so dispirited, a glimmer of sorrow flashed through the black-clothed man's eyes. Because of the Qing Emperor's order, the pursuit of the black-clothed commander was the strongest. Although the provincial soldiers were not very powerful and the tiger guards had all died, the Qing Emperor's troops finally succeeded in blocking the black-clothed commander at an intersection. It seemed to be a dead end. The other party had at least 300 soldiers. It seemed impossible to kill them all. The sounds of pursuit rose again from behind. The Qing Emperor wanted to capture him alive. Once he could not, so what if he killed him? The black-clothed man had led the Northern Expedition Army to surround the mountain. He had only brought 2 trusted soldiers. However, this person led unfamiliar subordinates and was able to divide and surround the Imperial Army, not allowing a single one of them to escape. It could truly be said that he was a godly commander. In the end, the momentum on the battlefield was like a landslide. Even if he had extraordinary abilities, he could not make Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers overcome the respect and fear they felt toward the Emperor and Yi Luyun. In the end they still lost. Looking at the hundreds of soldiers in front of him, the black-clothed man, who had always appeared calm and gentle during the encirclement of the mountain, finally slowly straightened his body and carefully tied Master Xueqi to his back. The 2 trusted soldiers beside him each held an object wrapped in cloth. After untying the layers of coarse cloth, they revealed a metal rod about the length of an arm inside. The black-clothed man calmly accepted it with both hands and put it together with a clang. With a wave of one hand, killing intent surged. A long black metal spear suddenly appeared in his hand. With the spear in his hand, a powerful fighting spirit abruptly exploded from his calm eyes. His entire body also began to emanate a murderous aura. He was like a god of war. He squeezed the sides of his horse. Alone with Xueqi on his back, he charged toward the 300 soldiers. His aura was like thunder and could not be stopped. It was as if he had returned to that night in Shangjing, when the rain fell as arrogantly. 2 of his trusted soldiers died, but he escaped with Xueqi on his back, a provincial general reported in a trembling voice as he knelt in front of the Qing Emperor. Chapter 579. In just one night, the people who had come down from Dong Mountain had taken care of all the matters. For the first time in the history of the Qing kingdom, a rebellion in broad daylight had ended miserably. At least, the regicide had ended miserably and could not cause any more waves. Everyone, including the emperor, cold-blooded and slightly nervous, waited for the changes in Jingdo in a dozen days. The emperor was already very tired. Getting rid of the 2 great grandmasters, Xueqi and Sigurd, was indeed the most beautiful page of his life, but it had also used up too much of his strength and spirit. Particularly after such a long plan had become reality, the influence it had on his spirit made him not as powerful as people appeared. In his life, this was actually his weakest and easiest time to be defeated. However, no one realized this. No one dared to take advantage of this. Other than surrounding Dong Mountain and sealing off the news, tens of thousands of provincial soldiers were also desperately chasing Dongyi and Northern Qi's 2 powers that had sneaked into the country. The tiger was dozing off, but he forcefully narrowed his eyes and flashed with a cold light, scaring those who dared to offend him into wretched prey. Shang Shanhu was alone and had to take Xueqi to the north, so he was powerless to do anything. Although Yun Jilan, who was temporarily in charge of Dongyi's affairs, was also a master of swordsmanship, he was not a master of the art of war. He would not have thought that he would be able to turn back and seek some earth-shattering effect. This had nothing to do with courage. The Overwatch Council had already begun to move. The people from the 3 roads of inspections that had been arranged beforehand were densely spread out on every road from Dongshan Road to Jingdo. Although Chen Pingping was in Jingdo, his subordinates still displayed the powerful and glorious tradition of the Overwatch Council and displayed a terrifying ability to seal off information. Regardless of whether it was Shang Shanhu or Dongyi, even if they could send out information along the way to inform the eldest princess in Jingdo, they would not be able to do it within a few days. Additionally, they had taken a long detour to avoid being killed the entire way. When the truth of what happened at Dong Mountain reached Jingdo, it took 10 days longer than usual. The inconvenience of sending information brought Emperor Chen Pingping great convenience. Fan Xian was deep in the mountains carrying out his final battle with Yan Xiaoyi. He didn't know what had happened on Dong Mountain. After he had successfully killed Yan Xiaoyi, entered the Song Kingdom, and traveled south from Yanjing, the people who had escaped from Dong Mountain finally broke through the mountains and entered Dongyi's sphere of influence. Fan Xian's luck was not good. He had left the Song Kingdom a few days early, so he did not hear the news. Not long after he entered the Qing Kingdom, the commander of the Yanjing camp had already received a secret edict and secretly took over the leaderless northern expedition camp. At the same time, he forcefully separated the borders between the three countries. Strangely, regardless of whether it was the northern Qi or Dongyi people returning, they all seemed to unconsciously close their mouths tightly. By the time the northern Qi emperor received the news, it was already very late. Even if he sent a message to the eldest princess in the south, it would be too late to change anything. Sigu Jian of Dongyi, this madman, heavily injured and on the verge of death, for some reason, did not try to notify Li Yunrui in Jingdo. The reason was actually very simple. Once the news that the emperor was not dead got back to Jingdo, the internal chaos in the Qing kingdom would probably end before it even began. The Qing kingdom's national strength would not suffer any losses. This was something Sigu Jian did not want to see. Sigu Jian had to consider what path Dongyi would take after his death. In order to delay the Qing emperor's steps in unifying the world, it was perhaps more in line with Dongyi's interests to let the eldest princess know a few days later that the emperor was not dead. If they could have the eldest princess cause a ruckus in Jingdo, the Qing kingdom's national strength would certainly be damaged. Once the battle started, it would take at least 2 or 3 years for the Qing kingdom to recover and send out troops. Yanjing and Congzhou were already under strict lockdown. Not long after Fan Xian entered the capital, Jingdo was sealed. Even if Sigu Jian wanted to notify Li Yunrui, it would not be so simple. Most terrifyingly, the Qing emperor seemed to have calculated Sigu Jian's thoughts clearly. The thoughts of the great grandmasters were indeed interconnected. There was another important problem, which was Fan Xian's safety. As long as Fan Xian could successfully break through Yan Xiaoyi and return to Jingdo, Sigu Jian could not let Fan Xian die so early for the sake of Dongyi's future. In the last days of their lives, the great grandmasters had to consider even more further and deeper things. They had lost the most important battle at the hands of the Qing emperor but had left their hope in the future. They had left it on Fan Xian, who, no matter what, could not be Dongyi's hope. These were all things that would only happen a dozen days later. The Qing emperor was not a precise calculator. He could only deduce a general possibility. Fortunately, the development of the situation was not too far from his analysis. After taking care of the matter at Dong Mountain, he did not stay at the foot of the mountain. Instead, he headed northwest through the night until he reached Luozhou. In the early hours of the morning, he entered the city and took up residence in Governor Hou Yongji's manor. That day, the entire city of Luozhou was on lockdown. The provincial soldiers of Jiangbei Road, who had followed the emperor north, were ordered to take over the heavy responsibility of guarding the local provincial soldiers. A dozen officials and internal court eunuchs and aces took control of the entire manor. The people of Luozhou stared dumbfounded at everything in front of them. They didn't know where so many unfamiliar soldiers had suddenly come from. Furthermore, their gazes were unfriendly. They looked like wild beasts and carried a faint scent of blood on their bodies. It was clear that they had just come from the battlefield. The soldiers patrolled the streets of Luozhou, vigilantly watching everything around them. They brought a sense of solemnity to the largest city on Dongshan Road. It suppressed the common people so much that they no longer dared to whisper on the streets. Other than some essential matters, most of the time they retreated fearfully into their rooms. In the governor's manor of Dongshan Road, Governor Hou Yongji knelt before the emperor. He was not frightened, but his face was ashen. He kowtowed twice and did not say a word. He knew he was going to die, but he didn't know if he would be cut into 1,000 pieces or torn to shreds. He knew what would happen if he failed the moment he joined the eldest princess's plan. However, he did not expect that His Majesty would so easily resolve the situation at Dong Mountain. Before anyone could react, the emperor had pierced into the manor like a sharp arrow and landed right before him. The emperor did not look at him, and there was no disappointment on his face. He knew that the official kneeling at his feet would become the first Qing Kingdom's Governor-General to be executed in the past 30 years. He just counted the days coldly, trying to see if he could leave enough time for his sister. Luozhou City had become a dead city. No one could leave. Even though the eldest princess had planted spies in Dongshan Road, they had no idea what had happened in the manor. Some people outside the city had noticed the strange phenomenon in the city and began to send news back to Jingdo. However, every time they traveled a few dozen li, they would be killed by the Overwatch Council spies disguised as various characters. Chen Pingping had invested up to 40% of the Overwatch Council's manpower in these 3 areas. No wonder he was forced to lead the Jingdo garrison around Jingdo to engage in guerrilla warfare. For the sake of His Majesty's edict, the old director had gone all out. Just like that, he waited silently in Luozhou City for a few days. Estimating the time, the news of the emperor's death on Dong Mountain should have reached Jingdo, and Fan Xian should have arrived with the edict. Only then did the emperor's expression improve a little. After a few more days, the court sent urgent secret reports from Jingdo to the manors of the various provinces. The secret report regarding Dongshan Road and Luozhou Road arrived as quickly as possible. They began to question the truth of what had happened at Dong Mountain and seek confirmation. The emperor went through the procedures of the governor's manor and confirmed the news of his death. Then, he waited for the arrival of the procession from the court to receive his soul. The next day, the court bulletin arrived again. It mentioned the crown prince and Fan Xian's assassination attempt on the emperor. All the governors submitted petitions and began to oppose the court. Other than the governors of Jiangbei and Jiangnan, who knew the inside story, the governors of the other provinces were purely acting from the perspective of a high-ranking military official and a loyal subject of His Majesty. Although the emperor had not received the petitions from the other governors, he had a rough idea of what they would say. At this time, he ordered someone to bring out Governor Hou Yongji of Dongshan Road. Slowly, he said, "I have chosen the 7 of you to protect the world for me. 6 of them did not disappoint me. Only you." Hou Yongji had been imprisoned for many days and had not eaten or drank. He was exhausted. When he heard the emperor's words, he did not dare to beg for mercy. He knew that the day the emperor left Luozhou would be the day of his death. He only kowtowed with all his might, begging the emperor to spare his wife, children and mother. The emperor looked at him coldly and did not say a word. The next day, the emperor left Luozhou with the provincial army, ministers, and eunuchs. Before he left Luozhou, Hou Yongji was sentenced to death. His 3 children were beheaded, and all the people in the governor's office, as well as the officials from Dongshan Road who were held captive, were executed. The emperor was not a man who was easily angered, and he did not want to torture Hou Yongji, who had betrayed the court, with harsh punishments. In his opinion, killing a person was a necessary means for a ruler to retain power, and it had nothing to do with punishment. On the 6th day after receiving the crown prince's coronation announcement and Fan Xian's crimes, the emperor, who was slowly making his way from Luozhou to the capital, finally saw the procession that had come to receive him. Of course, the original purpose of this procession was to receive his body and soul. After coming into contact with the procession, the emperor gave an order coldly. The procession picked up its pace and continued to approach the capital. A few more days passed. The capital was still far away, and the emperor did not know what the current situation was in the capital. Chen Pingping and the emperor were like 2 wandering ghosts in the fields of the Qing kingdom, drifting in the air. They did not pay any attention to the task of gathering intelligence. However, the cooperation between these 2 wandering ghosts was too perfect, and they appeared to be too powerful. One day, the emperor passed by the outskirts of Xinyang City. He looked at the unfamiliar city in the distance and said nothing. After a while, he turned his head and looked at the hearse behind the procession, and the huge coffin in the hearse, which was unknown in weight and layers. A self-deprecating smile appeared at the corners of his lips. "Tell Yun Rui," the emperor said. Eunuch Yao, who was riding beside him, quickly took out a pen and paper and listened attentively. "I'm back," the emperor said coldly. Then, he squeezed his horse's abdomen and rode ahead of the procession past Xinyang, heading toward the capital in the distance. The strings of the zither had already snapped, and the flowering tree had already been destroyed. The eldest princess, dressed in a rainbow dress, was standing in a daze by the lakeside of Taiping Courtyard, looking at the intelligence report she had just received in her hands. She completely ignored Fan Xian, who was sitting not far from her feet. From the beginning of the plan, she had already gradually moved her power from Xinjiang to Jingdou. This process had taken 2 years. Including the dead Huang Yi and the living Yuan Hongdao, they had all moved from the Li Palace in Xinjiang to Jingdou. However, on the stormy night before the New Year, the Emperor and Chen Pingping had only used an hour to completely wipe out the eldest princess' power. Presently, the eldest princess was mostly hidden behind the scenes in the rebellion, planning the overall situation and persuading the powerful people under heaven to take action. One reason was that she was good at this kind of role, and another was that she had no choice but to choose this role. She controlled the crown prince and the second prince, which was equivalent to controlling the Yi and Qin families. However, her own intelligence network had already received a fatal blow. Within 2 or 3 years, it would be impossible for it to recover. Thus, when she received the urgent intelligence report from Xinjiang, she couldn't help but furrow her brows and feel a glimmer of surprise. This intelligence report was fake. As the ruler of Xinjiang, Li Yunrui could tell at a glance that it was fake. However, this intelligence report was real, or it could be said that Xinjiang had already been completely controlled by someone, which was why they could use their own channels to send an urgent secret report to her. Who was it? Li Yunrui was surprised, curious, and hopeful. She tore open the sealed cover and swept her gaze lightly over it. Then, her gaze focused on the paper. There were only 4 words on the paper, but these 4 words made her stare for a very, very long time. The emotions contained in her eyes were complicated, very complicated. These 4 words seemed to be reflected in her dark and bright eyes. As each word was typed out, it became the constriction and expansion of her pupils, the intensity of her gaze, and the faintness of her gaze. First, there was a powerful shock in her eyes. Then, there was a faint disappointment. Immediately after, there was an inexplicable anger. Shortly after, it turned into a faint self-mocking smile. In the end, like a stone falling into a lake, it gradually became calm. In just a moment, so many emotional changes had occurred in the eyes of the most beautiful and ruthless woman in Qin Kingdom. Fan Xian watched her quietly from the side, watching the change in her eyes. He did not see the craziness that terrified him. His heart was slightly at ease. Immediately after, with a thump, he guessed the contents of the letter. Even the Yi family's betrayal and his control of Jingdou had not made Li Yunrui lose her composure like this. Then, there was only one person in the world who could make her like this. Li Yunrui once again lowered her head and carefully read the 4 words on the paper. I have returned. The handwriting on the paper was strong and powerful. It was the Emperor's handwriting. However, Li Yunrui could tell at a glance that this was eunuch Yao's writing. Although the Emperor was a diligent ruler, he had to lead such a large country and handle so many memorials. He would still be mentally exhausted. Memorials that were not harmful were often given to eunuch Yao for approval. Over time, eunuch Yao had learned 90% of the Emperor's handwriting. It was enough to fool the officials in court and the imperial censors. However, Li Yunrui had put a lot of thought into her brother. How could she not see the difference? She did not suspect that this was a lie. Someone had used eunuch Yao's handwriting to pretend that the Emperor was still alive. She knew that other than the Emperor, no one else would have thought of saying such simple and powerful words. The meaning of these words was very simple. I have returned. I am still alive. Do as you see fit. 2 lines of tears fell from Li Yunrui's eyes without reason. This was an indescribable emotion that stimulated her tear ducts. It made this woman, who loved to cry in front of the Empress Dowager, cry in this lonely Taiping courtyard. This was probably the Qing Emperor's last message to his sister. His last words, Li Yunrui thought sorrowfully in her heart. Did he disdain to personally write his last words? The Emperor would never have thought that these words would make Li Yunrui feel so many emotions. He was only announcing his return as an emperor. Like a lion, he announced to the world that he had supreme authority over his territory. Fan Xian did not understand why the eldest princess was crying. There was not a hint of madness on this crazy woman's face. She was only sad and sad. No matter what, he would never have thought that the eldest princess would be angry and sad because the Emperor did not personally write these words. Without question, the Emperor and Fan Xian were both intelligent people, but they still could not understand women. For men, women were, without question, a completely different species, a stranger from a distant and unknown space. Li Yunrui weakly let go of her fingers. The paper floated down from between her fingers. Brushed by the early autumn wind, it landed on the small lake in the middle of Taiping Courtyard. The paper was soaked in the lake water and immediately sank toward the surface. Startlingly, Fan Xian saw the words clearly. His heart filled with shock. Although he had thought of the possibility that the emperor was still alive after the Yi family rebelled, seeing it with his own eyes and confirming it, he still couldn't help but be shocked. He didn't know exactly what had happened on Dong Mountain. Since the emperor was still alive, the eldest princess had suffered a crushing defeat. Although she had said so earlier, Fan Xian knew that if she could destroy all the powerful men in the world in one fell swoop, that would be the most satisfying for her. This was the good news Fan Xian had been waiting for. If the emperor died, he was truly worried whether or not the Yi family would continue down this path. Fan Xian clenched his fists with difficulty, suppressing his excitement. Slowly standing, he gazed at Li Yunrui's back. He was worried whether or not this woman would give some crazy order after being provoked by this news. Li Yunrui gently clapped her hands. Many aces surged in around the small lake. Fan Xian swept his gaze over them and was not afraid. Perhaps these people summoned by Xinyang were terrifying in the eyes of a normal person, but they were nothing to him. He was only worried about Wan Er and De Bao. Unexpectedly, to Fan Xian's surprise and the shock of the subordinates, Li Yunrui's expression was calm. She slowly opened her mouth and said, "You can all leave. We don't need you here anymore." She paused for a moment and then said, "Hide your names and live out the rest of your lives in peace. Don't think about such laughable things as revenge." The subordinates were in an uproar. They looked at the eldest princess with disbelief and said in a pained voice, "Your Highness." From the moment Fan Xian stepped into Taiping Courtyard, these people knew that a major problem had appeared in the Jingdo rebellion. However, they still had great confidence in the eldest princess. Li Yunrui only smiled indifferently and waved her hand. She didn't say anything more. "Your Highness." The subordinates knelt down in front of her on the small hill and around the small lake. They refused to leave. A few of them even began to cry. Fan Xian looked at this scene in shock. Although he knew that Li Yunrui had already given birth to the thought of ending her own life after the failure, which was why she had sent her subordinates away, he had not expected that these subordinates would be so loyal to her. He had very little contact with Xinyang and didn't know how the eldest princess controlled her subordinates. With the emperor's indulgence and Chen Pingping's help, he had more victories than losses in the battles against the eldest princess these 2 years. He couldn't help but feel a bit of contempt toward Li Yunrui. Seeing the crying subordinates unwilling to leave and feeling everyone's loyalty toward the eldest princess, only then did Fan Xian faintly understand something. For example, why this princess had so much power in court, why she could convince Ku He and Sigurjian to act, why she could control the crown prince and second prince, why. This was just a feeling. He still didn't know where the eldest princess magic came from, but he knew that this was not an effect that could be achieved by peerless beauty. Unfortunately, Fan Xian didn't know in the past. It looked like he wouldn't have a chance to see the eldest princess' true power. There were cries all around. The eldest princess, who was by the lake, furrowed her brows slightly. Appearing slightly annoyed, she waved her hand again. A leading official looked at this scene and knew that the matter was over. Wiping away the tears at the corners of his eyes, he knelt down and kowtowed loudly. Resolutely, he turned and left. When one person left, many others also left. Perhaps none of these people were greedy for life or afraid of death. However, since Li Yunrui had given the order and Her Highness was clearly unhappy, other than leaving, they had no other choice. Thus, only the eldest princess and Fan Xian were left in Taiping Courtyard. Although it had been like this earlier, Fan Xian knew that there were many people watching him outside. Now that he knew those people had all left, his heart felt even more lonely. Looking at the eldest princess' thin shoulders, he felt slightly lost. Li Yunrui slowly turned around. Her 2 hands were placed elegantly on her abdomen. Her wide sleeves hung low, forming a beautiful and luxurious line. There was still a slight smile on her face, but her gaze was particularly clear. She was no longer the sinister figure in front of her enemies. She was no longer the weak person who was often slapped and cried in front of the Empress Dowager. She was no longer the stubborn, angry, and sorrowful sister under the Emperor's iron hand. She was the eldest princess. She was Li Yunrui, the one and only in the world. Li Yunrui looked at her son-in-law with a slight smile and said,
You don't seem to be as happy as I imagined to know that the emperor is still alive.
Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and said, "Recently, a lot of people have died. I can't be happy." "So that's how it is. It looks like you really are like your mother." Li Yunrui stilled slightly and then smiled. She used an inexplicable emotion to end this topic. She turned and asked coolly, "Have you ever thought why the Qin family rebelled?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He didn't understand the meaning of these words. He also didn't know why, at such a time, she would suddenly mention the Qin family that had already been driven out of Jingdou by the Dingzhou army. The eldest princess glanced at him with a slightly mocking gaze and then sighed. She looked at the piece of paper that had already sunk to the bottom of the lake. The lake water of Taiping Courtyard was extremely clear and shallow. The white paper gradually spread in the lake water like a piece of steamed bread that had been soaked in water. Countless red carps came forward to fight for it, and the water churned. She watched this scene calmly and said, "In reality, we are all fish. It's just that the things we fight for are not the same. This time, I didn't get anything. I had thought I would be angry and disappointed. I was indeed angry and disappointed. In the end, I realized that he is still alive. In the end, I am still happy." Fan Xian thought with slight sorrow. Based on what the eldest princess had said earlier, she had already reached her goal in life. As for whether the emperor died or not, what did it matter? Since the emperor had returned, the eldest princess probably had no way out. Then, he saw a scene that shocked him to the core. Li Yunrui's expression was calm and tranquil. She slowly lowered her arms. The light-colored wide sleeves of her palace robes hung down naturally and spread out. It was as if a great play had ended and an actor had walked out for the last time to express his thanks to the audience. The last actor was not only herself, but also a black poisoned dagger. This dagger was stuck deep into her abdomen, up to the hilt. Fan Xian's heart trembled. His entire body flew over and pushed her to the ground. He extended a hand toward her abdomen. "I still have some scenes with the eldest princess tomorrow, so I can't bear to write anymore. Yesterday, the men's basketball team won, which gave me a lot of strength. Looking at the monthly vote rankings today, I found that during this period of time, the rankings have perfectly carried out the spirit of the Olympics. Everyone is chasing after each other. It is serious, nervous, and lively. I haven't seen such a tense and interesting situation in a long time. The Olympics is about participation. Since I am participating, of course, I have to work hard to fight for the top. If anyone has extra monthly votes, brothers and sisters who have seen my torment from these 20 chapters, please vote them for me. I am very grateful. I won't say much about asking for votes, but at least I fulfilled my promise." Fan Xian pushed down the eldest princess. "Ahem, don't slap my face." Chapter 580. Fan Xian's reaction was fast enough.
Like a shadow, he charged over and pushed the eldest princess to the ground.
His fingers moved like the wind. In a flash, he used Xueqi to forcefully seal a few major meridians around her wound.
However, he still found that a faint black aura had already slowly enveloped her bright face.
This black dagger had been stuck in Li Yunrui's abdomen for a while. However, it had been covered by the wide sleeves, so Fan Xian had not seen it.
What shocked him even more was that the eldest princess was still able to speak to him so freely with a dagger in her abdomen. She did not reveal a glimmer of pain and successfully hid it from his eyes. During this time, the poison had already flowed through her entire body along with her blood. It had entered her heart and faintly floated to her face. Even if Fei Jie appeared in Jingdou right now, he would not be able to save her life. Fan Xian lowered his head and looked helplessly at the dagger in her abdomen. Looking at the hilt of the dagger, he couldn't help a slight chill in his heart because it looked familiar.
However, this was not the time to worry about such things. He supported the eldest princess' shoulder with one hand and pressed the other against her soft abdomen. The heart of Tianyi Dao he had inherited from northern Qi was poured in without hesitation. After a long while, the eldest princess, who had been silent without a trace of pain, finally frowned. She looked at him with a reproachful gaze and said, "I just wanted to savor the taste of pain and death. Why did you disturb me?" She had always been high and lofty. As the little princess of the royal family, she was loved by her parents and brothers.
Who dared to make her suffer? Other than the Empress Dowager's 4 slaps and the Emperor's violent rage on that stormy night, Li Yunrui truly did not know what it was like to have pain sink into the marrow.
These words were said somewhat crazily, but Fan Xian did not have the leisure to bicker with her. Silently, he poured in Xueqi and forced the poison in her body to one place. Gradually, the faint black color on Li Yunrui's face grew thicker and thicker. It then gathered toward her temples.
The skin on the other parts of her face returned to its usual brightness.
Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt. His right palm patted her soft abdomen. Li Yunrui's red lips parted slightly. Immediately after, his left hand reached like lightning into his clothes and took out a pill, stuffing it into her mouth. He was very familiar with the poison on the dagger because he had made it, so the pill immediately took effect. However, Li Yunrui had covered it for too long.
The poison had already entered her heart and could not be forced out.
The sweat on Fan Xian's forehead poured out. He couldn't help but think of the movies and novels he had seen in his previous life. Those chilling scenes. His left hand gripped her shoulder tightly.
"Where is Warner?"
he yelled in a hoarse voice. "Where's Debao?" In those stories, after the male protagonist achieved the final victory, he would painfully discover that the enemy would not tell him where the relatives he had captured were hidden or if they were dead. This was to torture the male protagonist for the rest of his life. The dark and gloomy film and the separation of the fluorescent screen made Fan Xian afraid. His voice trembled and he completely forgot how he should react.
He angrily and helplessly roared at her.
Li Yunrui glanced at him mockingly. Her brows moved slightly again. It looked like the poison on the dagger had completely entered her body.
The sharp pain finally began to clearly attack her nerves.
She lowered her head to look at the black dagger stuck in her abdomen and quietly said, "Don't always use your little cleverness and tricks. Those are things only useless people would use." Fan Xian's entire body was cold. He knew what the eldest princess meant by these words. The reason this black dagger was familiar to him was because he had made it himself. It was exactly the same as the dagger Sir Fei Jie had passed on to him when he was young.
The medicine smeared on it was also the same. In the present world there were 3 of these daggers.
Fan Xian hid one in his boot, the third prince Li Chengping hid one in his boot, and the last one was hidden in Lin Debao's boot. Of the people Fan Xian cared about, only the young Li Chengping and the silly Debao had the least ability to protect themselves. Thus, he had carefully passed these 2 daggers to them, waiting for the final moment to deliver the most shocking blow to the enemy. In the palace, Li Chengping had used this black dagger to protect his own life, while Debao's black dagger was in the eldest princess's hands and in her abdomen. "You thought I would use Debao to threaten you."
When Debao was by my side and you suddenly gave the order, he would pull out a dagger and stab me.
Li Yunrui coughed up a trickle of blood and looked mockingly at Fan Xian.
Of course, no one would seriously search a fat idiot, and no one would be on guard against him.
Li Yunrui's gaze gradually dimmed.
She slowly said, "You've been with Lin Debao these years.
Was it just for that moment? You told him I killed Lin Gong, so he hates that person called Li Yunrui. No one in the world dares to call my name in front of this idiot, other than you." She looked at Fan Xian like she was looking at an idiot. Using too many little tricks, thinking too complicated, and not generous at all. Fan Xian's entire body was cold. He had not thought that his last move would be so laughable in the other party's eyes and so easily seen through.
He took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed the fear in his heart. Evenly, he begged, "Tell me, where are they?"
Li Yunrui did not look at him. Her body gradually grew cold. Her shoulders unconsciously shrank back. "I am about to die. What is the need to leave Warner alone in the world to be bullied by men? She is my wife. I will protect her." Li Yunrui's eyes looked to the side.
In a trembling voice she said, "I had wanted to kill your concubine, but I did not succeed.
You will have many women in the future.
Why should I let Warner continue to suffer?"
She turned her head and looked calmly into Fan Xian's eyes. "Don't worry, I won't use her life to force you to become an ascetic monk." Fan Xian's heart jumped slightly.
He stared in a daze at the beautiful face in front of him.
At this moment, the poison had all gathered on the 2 sides of her temples. Following her blood vessels, it turned into a few streaks of green, just like 2 green flowers at her temples. There was a strange beauty to it. Li Yunrui looked at him mockingly. She slowly raised her right hand and pulled Fan Xian over. She leaned weakly against his shoulder. Her face was close to his face, and her body was leaning against his. It appeared very intimate. She used this warm position to move closer to his ear and quietly say, "Why did the Qin family betray? Go ask Ping Ping. I can only guess." Even at death's door, this exceptional beauty still exhaled like orchids. Her slightly warm breath blew against Fan Xian's ear. It felt strangely charming. Of course, Fan Xian did not have any other thoughts. His eyes looked at the blue flower at the corner of his brow that was close at hand, and listened to the voice gradually reaching his ears. The gaze in his eyes became more and more serious, more and more shocked, and more pained. Li Yunrui laughed lightly by his ear and said, "Although I am dead, to be able to leave behind the emperor's most powerful enemy, presumably, a Qing kingdom without me would not be too bored." Fan Xian's mouth was dry. He couldn't speak for a moment. He could only lower his head disappointedly. Although he was silent, he still displayed a powerful hesitation and loss. "This is your mother's courtyard. I wanted to burn it down, but after thinking about it, I decided to leave it to you. This place is very beautiful. Most importantly, I think you need this place to understand some things. You won't let me down." Li Yunrui glanced at her son-in-law one last time and said with slight mockery, "You even want to use that idiot to bow? In this world, there are only two people as shameless and hypocritical as you. One is the emperor and the other is you. So, I think very highly of you." At this time, Fan Xian's entire body was frozen. He did not hear the last words at all. Immediately after, a strange sound came from behind him. It made his heart jump. Turning around to look, he saw that the flowering tree behind the broken zither had moved, revealing a small hole below. In the hole were Wan and Dabao. Both of them were tightly bound. Cloth had been stuffed into their mouths. It was impossible for them to speak. Wanner's eyes were slightly red. She looked at Fan Xian with a worried gaze. Seeing that Fan Xian was not injured, 2 clear lines of tears flowed down. Dabao's gaze had been blank. After he saw Fan Xian, it became filled with a silly smile. Immediately after, Wanner noticed her mother in Fan Xian's arms. She also noticed her mother's strange condition. Her eyes immediately filled with terror. Fan Xian had already pushed aside the eldest princess in his arms and rushed to the side of the tree. Lifting Wanner and Dabao up, he flicked his finger and cut the ropes binding them. Having escaped a great disaster, Wanner had no time to take out the cloth in her mouth. She rushed past Fan Xian and threw herself at the eldest princess's side. Kneeling by her side, she began to cry. Fan Xian sighed quietly in his heart and prepared to go over. He found that the corner of his clothes was being pulled on by someone. Turning his head to look, he saw Dabao laughing foolishly and happily pulling on him as if he never wanted to let go again. Fan Xian's guilt swelled up. Shortly after, he felt a faint sorrow. Li Yunrui had been pushed to the ground by Fan Xian. The poison had long entered her heart. The 2 smears of poison on her forehead appeared increasingly azure. Contrasting with her delicate and white skin, it was like the beautiful blue and white flowers on fragile porcelain. However, these blue and white flowers were all poison. Just like her, even if she died, she wanted more people to die because of a few words she said. Wan grabbed her mother's hand with one hand and took out the cloth stuffed in her mouth with the other. With a wail, she began to cry. Although this mother and daughter were very different from other mothers and daughters in the world and were not very close, they were, after all, connected by blood. In the last moment, Li Yunrui did not choose to use Wan Er's life to threaten Fan Xian. Wan looked at her dying mother and couldn't help but feel sorrow rise from her heart. She could not stop the grief and pain. Li Yunrui's icy right hand held her daughter's hand tightly. Smiling with difficulty, she raised her hand for the last time and pressed her temples together. It was as if she wanted to maintain her most beautiful image when she left this world. Her fingertips brushed past the wretched blue and white flowers, contrasting with the mocking smile at the corners of her lips. She didn't know who she was laughing at. Perhaps she was laughing at the fact that Fan Xian had held her in his arms earlier and then, as soon as he saw Wan pushed her onto the grass with unusual cold-bloodedness. Perhaps she was thinking of the stormy night in the royal palace, that timid but affectionate nephew, or perhaps she was thinking of her childhood stories from many years ago. Then, she smiled disdainfully and said her last 3 words in this world. Men. Looking at the eldest princess' gradually freezing body on the grass,
Fan Xian's heart also gradually grew icy. He knew that the most powerful and ruthless enemy in his life had finally ended her life that was difficult to judge. Accurately speaking, from the Dong Mountain incident to the final Jingdo rebellion to the dagger in Taiping courtyard, Li Yunrui had only died to his hands. Her heart had long died. This was a strange and powerful woman. If Fan Xian didn't have that black chest, he would probably have long died to Yan Xiaoyi's hands. The entire situation in Jingdo would have long fallen into the eldest princess's control. In the end, she was a woman. She was not the most powerful person in the world. Compared to the unfathomable emperor, who no one knew how he had survived Dong Mountain, the eldest princess had a fatal weakness. Perhaps, it could be said that she had one more weakness than the emperor: love. Perhaps this love was absurd and awkward, but it was still love. What was love in the world? It made people promise to live and die for it. When Yuan Haowen wrote these two lines, presumably, he had not thought that there were so many people in this world who used their actions to enrich the meaning of these two lines. There were infatuated children among people. Without question, the eldest princess was also an infatuated person. However, had she truly lost? In Fan Xian's eyes it was not so. She had basically done everything she wanted to do in this life. Furthermore, the words she had quietly said by Fan Xian's ear at the end, although they didn't point anything out, had already planted a poisonous flower in Fan Xian's heart. It was just like the poisonous blue flower that appeared at the corner of her brows in the last moment of her life. Wana threw herself onto the eldest princess's body and cried endlessly. Lin Dabao was behind Fan Xian, pulling on the corner of his clothes. He looked at this scene nervously and confusedly, thinking, the princess's mother is asleep, so why is my sister crying? The eldest princess's face was still beautiful. With long eyelashes and blue flowers at her temples, she was like a sleeping beauty waiting for someone to wake her with a kiss. Fan Xian looked at this scene. His heart was at a loss. He unconsciously spat out a somewhat unfamiliar phrase from his lips: Jesus cum Jesuus. This was a 14th century French poem. He remembered some fragments from a movie he had watched in his previous life. At this moment, those words reappeared in his mind, exceptionally clear. This is how I am. This is how I am. This is how I was born. When I want to laugh, I laugh loudly. I love those who love me. This shouldn't be my weakness. Every time I love someone, every time I will love them. This is how I am. This is how I am. I was born to please others, and this is something that cannot be changed. I please those who make me happy. What can you do about this? I love someone, someone loves me. Like children in love. Jingdo sank into the greatest chaos. Although the Yi family and the imperial army had reduced the Qin family into crippled soldiers, driven them out of Jingdo, and controlled the 9 city gates, the situation in Jingdo was even more chaotic than before. However, the situation in Jingdo was even more chaotic than before. Earlier, when the two armies were facing off, the common people of Jingdo had all cowered under their beds in their homes, not daring to make a single sound. Now that the situation was beginning to become clear, the frightened and dejected citizens finally summoned their courage and fearfully surged toward the city gates. The common people of Jingdo often had their own poor relatives in the countryside outside the city. In such a dangerous moment, they wanted to think of a way to escape and hide. Otherwise, who knew whether or not the soldiers, who had gotten excited from the battle, would come and loot Jingdo after victory was decided? Their worry was not without reason. At least, in Jingdo, a few wandering soldiers and subordinates who did not have strict military discipline had begun to loot as they chased each other. The streets and alleys were in chaos. Women's screams rang out frequently. Occasionally, sparks would shoot into the sky. The Qing army's military discipline had always been strict. The chaos that had occurred was partly because of the terrible consequences that war would inevitably bring. It was also because this battle was an internal rebellion. Regardless of whether it was the Yi family, the Qin family, or the soldiers of the garrison, they all felt an indescribable sense of disillusionment. The darkest part of the human heart began to rise. Gong Dian did not lead his troops out of the city in pursuit. He immediately began to clean up the order in Jingdo. However, Jingdo was too big. It was impossible to completely control it in a short time. The common people of Jingdo could not wait for General Gong's cleansing operation. They knew the danger the remaining soldiers would cause after the battle. Putting their lives on the line, they surged toward the city gate that Gong Dian personally guarded. The scene was chaotic.
The silent Fan Xian was received by a small group of Dingzhou soldiers and Overwatch Council secret agents who had come out to receive him. He returned to Jingdou through another city gate, returning to his long-awaited home. He did not rush back to the palace or see Yi Zhong. Instead, he returned directly to the Fan Manor. He had no time to comfort Wan Er. He only asked about his father and King Jing's situation before pulling Tang Zijing to the side and giving him a few careful orders in a low voice. Ever since the Fan Manor had been surrounded, Tang Zijing had picked up a wooden stick and organized the guards and servants of the family to welcome the repeated edicts and harassment. Fortunately, Fan Jian was not in the manor, so the Fan Manor had not experienced any major attacks. The remaining soldiers were no match for the Fan Manor servants. Fan Jian had always been good at training soldiers. Tang Zijing listened to his young master's orders. His expression became cautious and he nodded his head heavily. He didn't ask for the reason. He didn't take too many conspicuous Fan Manor servants with him. He quickly headed in the direction of the 28-li slope. Chapter 581. Please don't criticize Lu Xiang, at least not in the book review section of Qing Yu's year. No one is easy, much less come up with conspiracy theories. Sometimes, reality may be stranger than fiction, but at least it has to be stranger and logical. My depressed brother-in-law and I continue to support him. Looking at the carriage moving into the distance and hearing the faint clamor coming from all around, Fan Xian relaxed slightly. He had arranged for Tang Zijing to go to Qingyu Hall on 28-li slope to take advantage of the chaos in Jingdou to think of a way to bring the old shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall out of Jingdou and scatter them among the people. This was not a sudden idea that Fan Xian had come up with. It was part of the plan he had drawn up from the beginning. These old shopkeepers were very important to Fan Xian. Their grasp of the arts of the palace treasury and familiarity with the secrets were even more important to the Qing kingdom. Although the emperor remembered old friendships and had left them alive, he would not allow them to leave Jingdou and fall into the hands of other powers. It had been 20 years since the Yi family had been destroyed. If he wanted to bring all these old shopkeepers out of Jingdou, it was an impossible task. However, the eldest princess and crown prince's rebellion and the chaos in Jingdou gave Fan Xian, who had been working hard on this matter, a great opportunity. Everyone in Jingdou thought the emperor had died. The palace was in chaos, and Jingdou was in chaos. A glimmer of light appeared in front of Fan Xian's eyes. However, he did not have many people he could use. Later, he faintly guessed that the emperor might still be alive, so he temporarily stopped this plan. But in Taiping Courtyard, the last few words the eldest princess whispered into his ear prompted him to make his final decision. Even without the eldest princess' words, Fan Xian would still think of a way to use the present situation. From the beginning, the battle between the emperor and the eldest princess had been proceeding on a different level. Although Fan Xian had been silent and seemed to be a chess piece being moved around, he actually had his own thoughts. He had predicted that Jingdou would fall into chaos, so he chose to fish in troubled waters and pull chestnuts out of the fire. His gaze and methods were truly sharp. Without time to comfort the grieving Wanner, Fan Xian turned and left the manor. The eldest princess' body was currently placed in a quiet room in the back garden. He had to return to the royal palace to deal with some more important matters. Since he knew the news that the emperor was safe and sound, he had to make some powerful adjustments in the arrangements of the entire matter. Unexpectedly, he had just left the manor when a group of riders approached on the dust. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked. He didn't know whose subordinates they were. The situation in Jingdou had long been settled. The Dingzhou army controlled the outside of the palace. Yi Zhong had very adroitly handed the defense of the royal palace back to the great prince. There were no organized rebel soldiers inside the city. The people who came were indeed from the Dingzhou army. An officer covered in blood pulled on the reins of his horse and scrambled toward Fan Xian. In a panic, he said, "Duke, the commander has urgent news to report." There were countless fierce and powerful generals in the Qing kingdom. Each army habitually referred to their commander as commander, just like how the old soldiers of the Western Expedition Army referred to the Great Prince. Since this officer was from the Dingzhou army, the commander he spoke of was Yi Zhong. Fan Xian was startled. He wondered if something had changed in Jingdou again. He had been anxious to see Yi Zhong, so he didn't say anything more. Pulling on the reins, he followed the small group of riders toward Donghua Gate. Along the way, He listened silently. Only then did he know exactly what had happened. Fan Xian listened to the officer's story and learned that while he was in Taiping courtyard, Yi Zhong had been looking for him for a long time. Crown Prince Li Chengqian had been blocked by Yi Zhong at Donghua Gate. The two sides were facing off and in the middle of negotiations. For some reason, Li Chengqian had requested that he go see him. Although the Yi family had suddenly turned traitor, the rebel army was still powerful. The battle power of the remaining soldiers could not be underestimated. Fan Xian had not thought that the crown prince would be trapped in Jingdo. Inside the seemingly stable city, there was actually such a dangerous confrontation hidden under a quiet city gate. His pupils constricted slightly as he sucked in a breath of cold air. If the rebel army was chased out of Jingdo and fighting broke out in the field, it would have nothing to do with him. Naturally, the Yi family and the various armies loyal to the emperor would take over. But he was blocked at Donghua Gate? Why didn't the crown prince charge out? As he thought this, the horses' hooves did not stop. It didn't take long for them to forcefully disperse the Jingdo people crowding out of the city toward Zhangyang Gate. Fan Xian and his group arrived in front of Donghua Gate. There was silence in front of Donghua Gate, a deathly silence. The Qin family rebel army, surrounded by the city gate department and Dingzhou soldiers, gripped the weapons in their hands tightly and looked nervously and hopelessly at the soldiers around them. In the center of the rebel army, the expressions of the Qin family generals had become very ugly. The two sides had been facing off at Donghua Gate for a full 2 hours. Under the crown prince's powerful restrictions, the rebel army did not launch a general attack toward Donghua Gate. They also did not launch a counterattack against the Dingzhou army. Yi Zhong, who was leading the Dingzhou army to surround this place, also displayed unusual patience. Just like this, he killed time and waited for the arrival of Fan Xian, who the crown prince had requested to be present. Yi Zhong was patient, but the generals of the rebel army waited like a year. Sweat flowed down their faces. However, they did not move rashly because defeat was like a mountain. If they truly fought, not many would survive. However, they also didn't know what the crown prince was thinking. This matter involved rebellion. How could they survive? Surrounded and protected by everyone, the crown prince, Li Chengqian's expression appeared particularly calm. He was only a little haggard, but he was not overly flustered. It was not until he saw Fan Xian coming from a distance that he sighed and seemed to calm down a little. The Dingzhou riders parted like a wave. Fan Xian rode alone through the street and came to Yi Zhong's side. Glancing at the crown prince, he furrowed his brows and didn't know what to say. Turning his head, he moved closer to Yi Zhong's ear and quietly said something. Yi Zhong's face lit up, and his eyes lit up. Immediately after, he felt his heart palpitate. He knew that his previous conservative decision to give the crown prince time was the right one. Since the emperor had not died, the emperor should be the one to decide how to deal with the rebellious crown prince. Although he was a deposed crown prince who had rebelled, he was still the emperor's son. As the second prince's father-in-law, Yi Zhong did not want the crown prince to die in his hands. Fan Xian raised his eyes to look at the crown prince. The crown prince looked back at him. His pale lips trembled slightly. It was as if he had finally made an important decision. In a raspy voice he slowly said, "You've come?" The rebel army threw down their weapons and surrendered. They became the prisoners of the Dingzhou army. A few of the Qin family generals were also captured and fell to the ground with faces of despair. The battle in Jingdo had temporarily come to an end. Yi Zhong led the army and escorted a black carriage toward the royal palace. The black carriage had been sent over as soon as possible by the Overwatch Council. There were 2 people sitting in the carriage. One was Fan Xian, and the other was the crown prince, Li Chengqian. The 2 brothers sat in the dark carriage. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "There might be a problem with the third condition I promised you." Fan Xian's eyelids drooped slightly. In an apologetic tone he said, "If I can't do it, don't blame me for lying to you." Crown Prince Li Chengqian did not want countless innocent rebel soldiers to lose their lives because of him. With great courage, he had surrendered. He had asked Fan Xian to come personally and agree to his 3 conditions before he was willing to surrender. Li Chengqian knew that in Jingdo, Fan Xian, who held his father's posthumous edict and had the support of the majority of people, had more power in his words than Yi Zhong, who had an army but was secretly cautious. As long as Fan Xian was willing to agree, No one in court would make things difficult for these common soldiers. Hearing Fan Xian's words, Crown Prince Chengqian thought Fan Xian was going back on his word.
Staring into his eyes, he angrily said, "Why?
I can fight for the lives of common soldiers, but I can't guarantee they will survive. Although they are just cannon fodder, this is rebellion. Although Qing law is not strict, it does not leave them a way out." The Crown Prince didn't understand the word cannon fodder, but he could guess what it meant.
Fan Xian gazed at the Crown Prince's pale face and sighed.
As for the officials and generals who participated in the rebellion, I can't do anything about it. I know they won't survive, but I hope you won't implicate them. They are all large families. Once the killing starts, tens of thousands of people will probably die. Li Chengqian's expression was slightly dark. He hoped Fan Xian would make another promise. After all, Fan Xian had personally promised earlier in front of the two armies. Whether it's exterminating their families or implicating their 9 clans, this is not something I can control. Fan Xian's brows were furrowed tightly. A moment later he said, "Just like I said earlier, I will do my best to do what I promised you. As for how many people I can save, I cannot guarantee." An image floated in front of Fan Xian's eyes. Countless heads were chopped off, countless children were thrown to their deaths, and countless officials' wives and young ladies were sent into the government workshops and barracks, never to rise again. Even though he was a cold-blooded person, once he thought of the tragedy that was about to befall Jingdo, he still felt a chill. Men rebelled for their own power, officials, and nobility. In the end, the ones to bear the tragic consequences were not only them, but also their wives, young and ignorant children, distant relatives from home, and friends from many years ago. Li Chengqian's entire body trembled. He grabbed Fan Xian's collar with one hand. A rare courage appeared on his pale and slightly fearful face.
In a low voice he roared, "If you hadn't promised me, how could I have surrendered?
How could I have been willing to be your prisoner?" Fan Xian did not struggle free of the Crown Prince's powerless hands.
Lowering his voice, he roared back, "Not surrendering?
Do you really want to be killed in the chaos of the army?" Li Chengqian heard something else in Fan Xian's words. The hands gripping Fan Xian's collar unconsciously loosened.
In a trembling voice he said, "I, the Crown Prince, have already been deposed and am about to die."
"You are the regent, and the scholars all support you. Even if Ping ascends to the throne, you are still the emperor's tutor. You open your mouth and say one word. Who would dare to not listen to you?" The expression on Fan Xian's face was slightly indifferent.
He opened his mouth and said, "The emperor is still alive."
Li Chengqian abruptly heard this news. His arms hung weakly on his knees. Although he had already guessed this possibility when Yi Zhong first rebelled, once he actually heard the news, he still couldn't help but be shocked. "She is also dead," Fan Xian said quietly.
Fan Xian quietly said these words and then turned his face to look at the Crown Prince.
He saw that Li Chengqian's face had become increasingly pale.
His eyes stared woodenly and spiritlessly at the wall of the carriage.
He couldn't speak for a long time. He gradually lowered his head and bent his body, burying his head.
His shoulders trembled endlessly as he made a suppressed sound. Perhaps it was because he had been agitated by the Crown Prince's crying, but Fan Xian felt a wave of irritation in his chest.
Unconsciously, he activated Tianyi Dao's Zhenqi method to clear his meridians.
Unexpectedly, when he reached the center of his chest, he felt a wave of pain for no reason.
His vision darkened and he could no longer control it.
He spat out a mouthful of fresh blood onto the wall of the carriage with a splat.
From Dong Mountain to Jingdo, he had been heavily injured and had traveled tens of thousands of li. Before he had time to recover, he had forcefully used medicine to suppress it. He had also experienced countless dangerous battles. Finally, he could not hold on any longer, and his injuries exploded out. The Crown Prince's emotions were completely wrapped up in the news of his father's survival and his aunt's death. He did not notice Fan Xian's situation at all.
He buried his head in endless sorrow.
Fan Xian wiped away the blood at the corner of his lips and took a few rough breaths.
Glancing at the man beside him, he couldn't resist shaking his head.
Li Chengqian was about the same age as him. He didn't have 2 lives like Fan Xian, so he was just a young man. Just like this, one of the 2 brothers in the carriage vomited blood while the other cried. The black carriage entered the royal palace.
Having finished bandaging his wounds, the great prince silently led the carriage directly to the back of the palace, the door to the Eastern Palace. Fan Xian and the Crown Prince got out of the carriage and walked in. This Eastern Palace had always been the residence of the successor to the throne. Now, it had truly become the Crown Prince's prison, or perhaps, his future grave. The Great Prince and the Crown Prince quietly said something, glanced at Fan Xian, and then turned to leave. There was not a single person in the Eastern Palace. There were only the Imperial soldiers patrolling outside. Fan Xian didn't have much time to say anything to the Crown Prince. Holding his chest, he straightforwardly said to him, "You only have 1 day." Li Chengqian raised his head in shock. It was as if he had woken up from a nightmare. He stared at Fan Xian in a daze, not understanding what he was saying. The emperor should return to the capital the day after tomorrow. Fan Xian looked at him calmly. In the past, you once set fire to this Eastern Palace. I think it wouldn't be too surprising for the Eastern Palace to be burned again. Li Chengqian's expression immediately changed. He stared into Fan Xian's eyes as if trying to confirm what he was saying. His lips moved a few times, but no sound came out. Seeing that he didn't respond, Fan Xian lowered his head and darkly said, "Burning yourself to death is not difficult for you." Without waiting for him to finish speaking, Li Chengqian had already coldly shook his head and said, "Then, you will take advantage of the fire to rescue me from the royal palace and send me to a place no one knows about?" He looked at Fan Xian. His gaze was very complicated. "I don't know why you suddenly became such a gentle person, but I want to thank you." "There is no need to thank me," Fan Xian said. "However, the elders are used to arranging everything, but I am not used to it." Li Chengqian smiled with difficulty and said, "I truly can't see through you. You know I am a heartless person. It's rare for me to show kindness. The Empress is also dead. You should hate me. If you want to live, set a fire tonight," Fan Xian said. "It is not your style to take such a risk. My life has been gloomy for too long. I almost forgot that I once said I was going to live a full life. After experiencing so many things, only now do I understand that if I want to live brilliantly, I must first live with courage." Fan Xian didn't look at him anymore. He turned and left the silent palace. Li Chengqian stared at his back in a daze. He didn't understand why he would suddenly be so kind. His brows gradually furrowed and became sorrowful. Letting out a long sigh, he lay down on the floor of the vast palace. An aloof smile rose to his face. His 4 limbs stretched out. It was as if he had never been so relaxed and free. That night, the Eastern Palace did not burn. Fan Xian remained in the direction of Hongguang Palace the entire time, coldly watching in that direction. Confirming the peace of the Eastern Palace, he shook his head and felt a slight desolation in his heart. The emperor would probably arrive in the capital the day after tomorrow. Everything would once again return to the hands of that powerful emperor. Leaving the Crown Prince alive was not Fan Xian's idea on the spur of the moment. It was also not because he was soft-hearted. Rather, it was because of a sense of sorrow that he and the Crown Prince, as well as the second prince, were merely chess pieces on the emperor's chessboard. They were puppets controlled by fate or the elders. The Crown Prince no longer had any power. His life or death did not matter to Fan Xian. The Crown Prince was a good person. This was something Fan Xian had once said to Chen Pingping a long time ago. From the first time they met on the road outside the palace, the impression the Crown Prince had left on Fan Xian was warm, particularly in the last 2 years. Although there had been endless fighting, so what? Fan Xian was able to send 13th Wang to protect the Crown Prince on his trip to Nanzhao. At this time, he dared to let the Crown Prince live. If Fan Xian wanted to break free of the threads behind him and protect Li Chengqian's life, he would forcefully tear apart his stance for the first time. Presently, the entire royal palace was in his hands. Given the Overwatch Council's methods of disguising the scene and the Emperor's understanding of the Crown Prince's personality, it would not be difficult to use the excuse of self-immolation to hide it from the Emperor's eyes and ears without anyone knowing. However, the Crown Prince was like the eldest princess. His heart had long died. For someone whose heart had died, Fan Xian would not stupidly force himself to do anything. To be able to have such thoughts was enough to prove that after the spear in the meadow, his personality had changed a great deal. Night fell, and the palace lanterns were all extinguished. Outside the city, it was still not completely calm. Inside the royal palace, it was absolutely silent. The black sky enveloped the flat garden inside the palace.
The imperial soldiers and Overwatch Council officials stationed everywhere stood motionless like statues. "Who is it?" A cautious voice rang out inside Hongguang Palace. A serving girl lit the palace lantern. Seeing clearly the person in front of her, she quickly knelt down. Fan Xian waved his hand to indicate for her to rise. He ordered her to lead all of the serving girls and eunuchs out of Hongguang Palace. At this time, not many people knew that the emperor was already on his way back to the capital. As the regent and the third prince's teacher, Fan Xian was like a true emperor. The entire royal palace was unimpeded. No one dared to express doubt about his arrival. A dim lantern lit up. All of the serving girls and nannies retreated out of the palace in disheveled clothing. Fan Xian strolled alone through the vast palace and slowly walked to the phoenix bed. Looking at the old woman lying on the bed, he didn't wait for her hateful gaze to land on him. Fan Xian's right hand gently swiped and took out a thin needle that had not been dipped in poison. He pierced it into the old woman's neck. Looking at the unconscious Empress Dowager, Fan Xian crouched down and burrowed under the phoenix bed. Feeling for the secret compartment, his fingers pressed slightly and opened it. 3 years ago, he had once entered Hongguang Palace at night and used drugs to knock out the people inside. From this secret compartment, he had taken out the key to the chest and made a copy. At the time, there was also a white cloth and a letter in the secret compartment. Because of the urgency of time, he was unable to examine it closely. Today, there was a key and a white cloth in the secret compartment, but the letter was gone. Fan Xian held the white cloth in his hand and carefully stroked it. He sank into thought but still couldn't find a clue. A moment later, he put the white cloth back into the secret compartment and carefully returned it to its original state. He then stood up and sat beside the Empress Dowager on the bed. He removed the thin needle from her neck. Once the Empress Dowager woke up, her eyes stared hatefully at Fan Xian as if she wanted to eat him. It had already been a day and night. She couldn't say a word or move. She felt that her life, which didn't have much to begin with, seemed to be endlessly flowing out of her body. That kind of terror and anger, yet unable to be vented, made her go crazy. "The emperor is returning to the capital the day after tomorrow. I came to see grandmother." Fan Xian looked at her and said a moment later, "Are you very surprised? Only now do you know how big of a mistake you made a few days ago?" The Empress Dowager's eyes were filled with shock. If she had known earlier that the emperor was still alive, the situation in Jingdo would certainly not be like this. After the shock passed, a glimmer of joy appeared in her eyes. "Don't be happy too early." Fan Xian patted her wrinkled hand and said evenly, "I will let the emperor see you once and then you will die. Believe me, even if the emperor is the most powerful person in the world, in terms of medical skills, he is not as good as me." "If you don't believe me, you can try. You can already speak now. If you want to have a more dignified death and not like this, then please answer a few questions for me," Fan Xian said. "Who wrote that letter? What did it say? Also, what exactly is the connection between the Qin family and that matter 20 years ago?" Before the eldest princess died, she had told Fan Xian to ask Chen Pingping. He chose to simply and directly and crudely interrogate the Empress Dowager. "Don't think that I'm cold-blooded and shameless. Think about what you people did 20 years ago," Fan Xian said with his head lowered. "When you come out, you have to pay. As the Empress Dowager, I'm afraid you can't escape the cycle of heaven." Chapter 582. I recommend Rice Cake's new book to everyone. Please support it. Title: Ambitious Sky Demon Book Number 104246. The author's own YY introduction. The legend of the most powerful demon. Human beauties, demon saintesses, all stand still and don't move. Lie down obediently. P.S. Today's chapter is talking about how old Ginger doesn't die. It's just gradually fading. The despairing Empress Dowager didn't say the answer Fan Xian wanted to know. Her lips trembled as she closed her eyes with difficulty. Fan Xian looked at the wrinkles on her face. There were not many strange emotions in his heart. He had long guessed this result. However, to be able to have such a conversation with this seemingly benevolent but actually ruthless old woman in the middle of the night was a kind of spiritual comfort for him, particularly at a time when the emperor was about to return to the capital. In reality, the Empress Dowager of the Qing Kingdom could not be considered to have a heart as evil as a scorpion. In these decades,
She had not used the emperor's filial piety and power in her hands to harm too many people or do too many evil things, other than the matter with Yi Qingmei. For some reason, for Fan Xian, this old woman's connection to that matter 20 years ago was even harder to tolerate than trying to kill him. Furthermore, this old woman had always hated him. It was not until after the Hanging Temple incident and the emperor acknowledged Fan Xian's identity that she pretended to pray in the memorial hall and gave him a string of prayer beads to express her attitude. For people he admired and people who could not threaten him, Fan Xian could show his generosity and grace. However, for the Empress Dowager who had the power to threaten him, he did not admire her. He would also not show the filial piety and gentleness of a grandson. After the emperor returned to the capital and learned of everything that had happened in Jingdo, regardless of whether or not he could understand Fan Xian's forced entry into the royal palace at night and his helplessness in pointing his sword at the Empress Dowager, Fan Xian would not leave himself too many fatal openings. He slowly used his hands to massage the Empress Dowager's arm and sent Xueqi into her body, helping the slow release of the medicinal properties of the pill in her body gradually speed up, allowing her threads of life to gradually dissipate. After carefully doing all of this, the Empress Dowager once again became a person who could not speak or move. Even her gaze became dim and vacant, like the dementia of an old person before death. From a clean and efficient point of view, Fan Xian should have had the Empress Dowager die naturally before the emperor returned to the capital. However, he did not dare take this risk and gamble on the emperor's heart. If the Empress Dowager could live until the emperor returned to the capital, then Fan Xian would not have to be responsible for her death. If the Empress Dowager died during the few days Fan Xian was supervising the country, he would probably have to face the emperor's unreasonable anger. He purposely raised his voice to say a few comforting words to express his filial piety and slight apologies. After waiting for a while, Fan Xian walked out of Hongguang Palace and nodded slightly to the serving girls and housemaids in the front hall. Under the respectful gazes of the crowd, he walked to the stone steps in front of the palace and glanced at the eastern palace in the distance. He didn't see any fire and didn't do anything else. At the brightly lit doors of the royal palace, Fan Xian saw King Jing hurrying over. This king was finally no longer dressed as a gardener. Instead, he was properly wearing a king's clothing. King Jing's manor and the Fan manor had always been on good terms. During the turmoil in Jingdo, they had relied on King Jing's identity to successfully hide their father in the manor. Fan Xian felt gratitude toward this king and quickly went forward to greet him with a deep bow. He knew the reason why this king, who had always refused to enter the palace, had hurried over tonight. The news in the palace had already been released. All of the officials and people in Jingdo knew that the Empress Dowager's anxiety had attacked her heart because of the Crown Prince and eldest princess's rebellion. Additionally, the royal palace had been surrounded and she had been frightened. She had also caught a cold and was bedridden. She probably didn't have many days left to live. Although King Jing often pretended to be a gardener and was unwilling to be close to his mother, he was, after all, the Empress Dowager's own son. Hearing this news, he rushed to enter the palace. He looked at the handsome junior in front of him and couldn't help but sigh. He glanced at Fan Xian but didn't say anything. Fan Xian's expression was calm. He had already clearly told King Jing that the Empress Dowager didn't have many days left. Although everyone knew that the Empress Dowager's anxiety had little to do with the Crown Prince, he was not worried that King Jing would see what he had done to the Empress Dowager. Some indirect news had confirmed that King Jing also knew martial arts. If he couldn't even hide it from King Jing tonight, how could the emperor, who was about to return to the capital? "Brother, is still alive?" King Jing asked after he finished sighing. Fan Xian nodded. "At Taiping Courtyard, I saw the emperor's letter to the eldest princess." The expression on King Jing's face was complicated. As a second-generation disciple of the royal family, he had never participated in any political affairs, but he knew how far the Jingdo rebellion implicated. The news that the emperor was still alive allowed him to clearly guess part of the truth. He said with slight mockery, "Brother, you are very broad-minded and have very powerful methods." King Jing immediately thought of someone and furrowed his brows slightly. "How is she?" Fan Xian knew who he was asking about. With a serious expression, he replied, "She has already passed away. She is now in the manor. I don't know what to do with her." "Please, Your Highness." King Jing's expression was slightly sorrowful. He cut him off and said weakly, "You are now the regent. Everything is up to you." Worried about his mother's illness,
He didn't say much to Fan Xian. He only briefed him on Minister Fan's situation. Then, led by a few eunuchs, he hurried in the direction of Hongguang Palace. Fan Xian learned from the king that his father had safely returned to the manor. His heart calmed slightly.
Shortly after, he remembered that there was still a large pile of troublesome matters to take care of in the manor.
He couldn't help but furrow his brows. Too many officials had died, and the emperor had not returned. Jingdo was in chaos. No officials from the various yamens had returned, and there was no trace of anyone from Taichung Temple. The eldest princess's follow-up could only be resolved later. After Yi Zhong resolved the crown prince's problem, he personally led an army out of the capital. He met up with the follow-up troops from Dingzhou on the plains and began to chase after the remnants of the rebel army. The great prince personally led the imperial army to guard the royal palace and could not easily leave. The scholars Xu and Hu were in the royal study dealing with some urgent documents. Fan Xian looked around. Although he was the temporary regent, he had become a loner. Without people in his hands, he couldn't do anything. Fortunately, after Sun Jingxiu of the Jingdo government surrendered, he resolutely carried out his duty. With the help of the Overwatch Council, he was working hard to maintain Jingdo's peace and order. During the day, the fleeing commoners had already left the city through Zhangyang Gate controlled by Gong Dian. The remaining commoners in Jingdo began to wait bitterly for peace. Silence returned to Jingdo in the middle of the night. The fires that had been lit everywhere during the day were gradually extinguished. There were only a few places that still flashed with the light of fire.
Fan Xian stood on the square in front of the palace gates and looked at the broken stone marks on the tiles, as well as the traces of fresh blood that had not yet been washed away.
He paused slightly. Jing Ji's group of Black Knights, as well as the Overwatch Council secret agents who had carried out the ambush outside Zhangyang Gate, had suffered heavy casualties. Those who had luckily survived had already been sent to the Overwatch Council's square building for treatment.
He trusted in the medical skills of his brothers in the Third Bureau.
The Imperial Academy of Medicine was also temporarily conscripted into private residences to bandage up the injured Imperial soldiers and Dingzhou soldiers. However, many people still died. In the far northeast corner, there were soldiers silently moving bodies. In the darkness, they piled up into a small mountain. It looked incomparably sinister. At this time, there was no time to move these bodies out of the city for burial. Fan Xian looked at this scene and took out a medicinal pill from his clothes. He didn't drink any water. He chewed it in 2 mouthfuls and swallowed it. It was not an ephedra pill. It was a normal healing medicine. He coughed and used his sleeve to wipe away the threads of blood at the side of his lips. He couldn't resist shaking his head. This was the first time he had experienced a true battle. Looking at scene after scene of tragic and heroic scenes happening in front of his eyes, he finally understood that digging graves and admiring corpses when he was young could not train his nerves to the point of being too emotionless. In the depths of his heart, he once again said to himself, "In this world, there is no good war or bad peace." He had to carry out the agreement he made with Hai Tang in the 5th year of the Qing calendar, even if he had to face a powerful enemy he had never encountered before. Qingyu Hall should have already been burned to ruins, Fan Xian thought to himself. In order to not raise suspicions afterward, the surrounding private residences would also suffer. After the chaos, who knew how many private residences in Jingdo would be burned and looted? Presumably, it wouldn't draw too much attention. At this moment, a rider galloped in from the northwest, startling the night that had just quieted. The people on and off the royal palace all tensed up. The exhausted imperial soldiers struggled to raise the weapons in their hands until they noticed that the newcomer was wearing the robes of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed as he looked at the subordinate galloping in front of him. He didn't say anything, but his gaze already carried a heavy questioning meaning. The newcomer was a member of the Qinian unit. Wang Qinian had single-handedly chosen him. His loyalty to him was without question. Thus, he had arranged for this person to secretly watch Tang Zijing's movements to prevent the old shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall from encountering any danger when they left the capital. It was clear that something had gone wrong for this subordinate to gallop in front of him. The Overwatch Council official looked into Fan Xian's eyes and reported in a low voice, "Something unexpected has happened." There were no unrelated people around, so Fan Xian said straightforwardly, "Speak." The official looked around and said carefully, "The ignition went smoothly, and there was no problem in mixing in with the fleeing crowd and getting out of the city.
However, the brothers who stayed here realized that they had alerted the spies here, but we don't know who they are.
Who were they?
Of course, Fan Xian knew. It had to be the spies the emperor had left behind. The things in the old shopkeepers' heads were too precious. There had to be a group of people in the palace responsible for monitoring them. Even if there was a rebellion in Jingdo, these people would still be lying in ambush.
I don't have many people on me, Fan Xian stared at him and said in a cold voice. I only gave you 20. Yet you still can't solve these problems.
The official lowered his head and didn't dare make any excuses.
The other party's background is strong. 3 of them got away.
Fan Xian no longer scolded the official because he didn't dare let too many people know about this matter.
So he carried it out very discreetly. Accurately speaking, he was taking a big risk.
There were many loopholes in the original plan, so the execution was not smooth. The official raised his head and glanced at him.
Using a complicated emotion, he said, 3 got away. We later chased after them and found a dozen dead bodies. And 1 person left a message for you. This sentence was difficult to understand. It didn't make any sense logically. 3 spies from the palace had gotten away, so how could they have found a dozen dead bodies? Fan Xian's heart thumped. What message? That person said, there was someone waiting at home. There was someone waiting for him at home, so Fan Xian rushed home at the first opportunity. It was the second time he had entered the manor today. He ran directly to his father's study in the back garden. The unlooted Fan Manor was still as beautiful as ever. The light in the study shone through the glass and onto the fake mountains and clear water. Just as King Jing had said, his father had already returned home safely. Fan Xian let out a secret sigh of relief. Without waiting for a report, he pushed open the door and entered. He saw Lady Lu packing something. Fan Xian looked around and knew that his father had finished drinking the sour berries. In a time like this, his father still had the leisure to drink sour berries. Fan Xian couldn't help but feel admiration for his determination. Mother, are you well? He respectfully bowed to Lady Lu. Lady Lu was now the official mistress of Fan Manor. Of course, this was because of his efforts when he first got married. Lady Lu smiled and said that she was going to comfort her daughter-in-law. She then left the study. Sitting in the armchair, the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, raised his head and glanced at his son. Relief and a glimmer of reproach flowed through his eyes. Ever since the incident in Jingdo, this figure of the older generation, who had been hiding everywhere in Jingdo, finally stopped hiding his thoughts. The spies outside of Qingyu Hall were killed by someone I sent. Fan Jian gently tapped on the desk. He seemed to be deep in thought. Evenly he said, I don't know why you became so radical. You actually dared to carry out such a flawed plan. Did you really think the emperor couldn't see through it? Fan Xian smiled bitterly. His mentality had indeed undergone a great change. However, such a thing as courage often meant a flaw. He sat down and respectfully said, Thank you, father. He knew that his father was secretly training the Tiger Guards for the royal family. It would not make sense if his father didn't have some hidden power. It was not surprising that his father had sent people to kill the spies of the internal court. Furthermore, since he had told Yi Zhong the shocking news of the emperor's survival, his father also knew about it. Killing is easy. The explanation afterward is what is complicated, Minister Fan said thoughtfully. Even if Jingdo is in chaos and the army is killing, have you ever thought that the old shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall would coincidentally all be burned to death in the fire? You placed a dozen bodies in the fire. That was just deceiving yourself. Fan Xian listened quietly to his teachings. And those spies of the internal court, even if you used the power of the Overwatch Council to kill them all, how can you guarantee that your subordinates didn't have the emperor's spies? They acted separately. Other than the Qinian unit, no one else knew the inside story, Fan Xian explained. All right, even if the Overwatch Council has been turned into a metal plate by Chen Pingping, let me ask you after this, who will explain to the emperor why all the spies of the internal court watching Qingyu Hall died without a single one left? Fan Xian was speechless. Only now did he understand that even if they killed people to silence them, the deaths of the spies of the internal court, who should not have died at the hands of the chaotic army, would still arouse the emperor's suspicions. Furthermore, these old shopkeepers still have family in Jingdo. Fan Jian looked at his son and said evenly, Do they really want to leave? Do they dare to leave? I only had Teng Zijing send the 4 old shopkeepers away. Qingyu Hall must have people alive for it to conform to common sense. Do you understand? I understand. A layer of cold sweat appeared on Fan Xian's forehead. As for fighting with the spies of the internal court and having designs on the old shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall, it is not you or me. It is the eldest princess. Fan Jian's gaze became cold. Those dozen bodies were Xinyang's suicide soldiers. Since we want to convince the emperor, we have to make him believe it. The person who acted had this need. The eldest princess knows the importance of the palace treasury. Of course, she would want to fight for Qingyu Hall. Only she has this ability and this thought. Fan Xian was completely convinced. Minister Fan suddenly sighed and said, "NG, I don't know what you are thinking or why you are doing this, but you have to remember, in the end, you are a person of the Qing kingdom. I am also a person of the Qing kingdom. No matter what, don't do anything that will harm the foundation of the Qing kingdom." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew his father had seen through his plans at a glance. He wanted to defend himself, but he couldn't bear to lie and deceive his father. He could only helplessly remain silent. Fan Jian looked at his son and sighed again. Shaking his head, he said, "I won't scold you. In the end, this palace treasury is your mother's. Although as an official of the Qing kingdom, I don't want to see certain things happen, you can do whatever you want." Fan Xian's entire body shook. He hadn't thought his father would make such a decision. His father would not lie to him or harm him. He knew the importance of the palace treasury to the Qing kingdom's unification of the world, so why would he still help him? I am already old, and I don't have much power. Perhaps Minister Fan knew something. A glimmer of tiredness and age appeared on his usually stern and handsome face. Slowly, he said, "After the emperor returns to the capital, I will ask for my resignation. I will help you as much as I can in Jingdo. I can't just watch as something happens to you." Chapter 583. Why? Faced with his son's shocked questioning, Minister Fan did not continue this topic. He smiled and changed the topic. "Is the situation in the palace still well?" Fan Xian replied after a pause. "The great prince is on duty with an injury, the Empress Dowager is seriously ill, and the Crown Prince has already been locked up in the Eastern Palace. There shouldn't be any problems." Fan Jian nodded. A glimmer of softness gradually appeared in his eyes as he looked at him. He sighed with admiration and said, "You've only been back in the capital for 7 or 8 days. To be able to protect Jingdo for the emperor under such difficult and dangerous circumstances, it has to be said that your improvement has already surpassed my expectations. You have performed very well." Receiving his father's praise, Fan Xian did not feel any joy in his heart. He smiled bitterly and said, "The great prince and I fought to the death in Jingdo. Who would have thought that the emperor had calculated everything? If it wasn't for the Dingzhou army's final betrayal, we would not have been able to hold the royal palace today no matter what." Without waiting for him to finish, Fan Jian waved his hand and stopped him. "The emperor plans deeply and thinks far ahead. His sacred heart is vast. He is not someone that we, as officials, can vainly speculate about." His tone revealed a glimmer of unnaturalness. He continued to speak and sighed. "The problem with the Yi family has truly exceeded everyone's expectations. A few years of coercion was actually the emperor's hidden pawn." He looked at Fan Xian and revealed a slightly scholarly smile. "From this, it looks like after the attack in the valley in Jingdo a year and a half ago, your judgment was correct." "I was wrong." Fan Xian was silent. After the attack in the valley last year, he and his father had once studied the problem of the city guarding crossbows. Later, although they knew it was the old Qin family's doing, they had wondered if the emperor would take his anger out on Yi Zhong. From this, they talked about the Qin kingdom's various military divisions. Surprisingly, during these 20 years, other than Yi Zhong, who had always been the commander of the Jingdo garrison, the commander of the royal palace's imperial army, and the head of the internal guards were both under one person. At the time, Fan Xian had suspected this. Since the emperor had once trusted the Yi family so much, why did he force the Yi family to ally with the second prince and lean toward the eldest princess's side? However, Fan Jian had given what he thought was the reason. Fan Xian thought it was reasonable, so he let go of this question. Unexpectedly, in the Jingdo chaos, this question finally revealed the truth of the emperor's hidden and suspicious weakness. The emperor had constructed a huge mystery. Not only had he fooled the eldest princess and everyone else in the world, he had even fooled Fan Jian, a trusted aide who had grown up with him since childhood. Speaking of the attack in the valley, the white snow, red blood, and heads in front of the Bureau of Military Affairs involuntarily rose in front of Fan Xian's eyes, as well as his own arrogance. He couldn't help but laugh bitterly. In front of the emperor and eldest princess, his arrogance back then seemed childish and laughable. His heart, he asked, "Father, why Qin, 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 Emperor Qin?" This was not only his question, it was also the question of many people. However, in the struggle for imperial power and the struggle for the power of the world, everyone naturally thought that the Qin family's betrayal was like every other internal strife in the history books. It was a matter of course. However, Fan Xian heard the eldest princess's words before she died. A poisonous flower bloomed in his heart. He began to pay particular attention to this question. Although the Qin family had a 10% share in the Ming family, and the Qin family had secretly ordered the Jiaozhou navy to massacre the island, for an elder of the military, just his face was enough for the emperor to easily let this matter go, as long as he remained loyal to the emperor. What kind of person was the emperor? If he had not never doubted Qin Ye's loyalty, how could he have allowed him to stay in the position of the Bureau of Military Affairs for so many years? These years, the old Qin master had always said he was ill and did not go to court. The position of the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs had never been empty. After he spoke of this question, Fan Jian did not think deeply about it. He directly and coldly said, "It was also on the day of the attack in the valley that I once said, the Empress's father's head was cut off by me." Who knows if the heads that should have been cut off were actually all cut off? Fan Xian's heart trembled. He understood his father's meaning. The old Qin family standing on the eldest princess's side in rebellion perhaps had something to do with his mother's strange death 20 years ago. Back then, when I followed the emperor to Shihu to fight, Chen Pingping was moved to the Yanjing area to deal with the emergency situation in the north, and Yi Zhong was stationed in Dingzhou to hold the line for the emperor. Fan Jian lowered his eyes and slowly said. At that time, Qin Yi was following the court's old practice. As the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, he controlled the center of Jingdo's military power. If he was also involved in the Jingdo rebellion, no one would find it strange. It was very strange. If the old Qin master was also one of the main culprits behind Yi Qingmei's murder, then why was the Qin family not implicated in the night of Jingdo's bloodshed 4 years later, when the empress's clan was completely slaughtered and Jingdo's nobility was massacred? If the emperor, Chen Pingping, and his father had joined hands to avenge his mother, how could they have let the old Qin master go? Meeting Fan Xian's questioning gaze, Fan Jian slowly said, "The problem is, there has never been proof that the Qin family was involved in this matter. Just like the Empress Dowager, at most, they are guilty of conniving." Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. Chen Pingping had once said this to him. Concerning his mother's death, the Empress Dowager should not be the main culprit. She could only be guilty of conniving. After discussing it with his father, Fan Xian suddenly thought that Director Chen probably had other thoughts in his heart. He had boundless suspicions about the role the Qin family had once played. The person who could best prove Chen Pingping's intentions toward the Qin family was the deputy commander of the Black Knights, Jing Gu. Why did Chen Pingping still secretly take such a dangerous figure who wanted to destroy the entire Qin family? Was it to make a move against the Qin family in the future? A chill rose in Fan Xian's heart. If the Qin family was truly, as Chen Pingping suspected, involved in Yi Qingmei's murder, why was he still alive? Thinking of this, a cold current began to surge out from within his body. Countless coldness seeped out from his pores, making the study become as cold as winter. He had guessed countless times and was infinitely close to the truth. However, he didn't dare ask. Even Chen Pingping didn't dare ask. Furthermore, Chen Pingping had heartlessly separated himself from him and didn't give him any chance to open his mouth. There had always been a knot in Fan Xian's heart. Thus, he had always quietly shifted his focus toward northern Qi. He had a natural fear toward the Qin kingdom. Now, this knot seemed to be unraveling and revealing the dark truth within. Thus, he was silent. He smiled slightly at his father and said, "If the Qin family was truly involved in this matter, it could be considered retribution."
He was worried that his father would follow this train of thought and think of the things he feared earlier, so he rushed to say, "The emperor will return to the capital in a few days."
Earlier, the court was still preparing for the emperor's funeral. "I don't know how it will turn around." Fan Jian smiled and said, "Naturally, the Ministry of Rites will worry about these things. Why do you need to care so much?" Fan Xian shrugged and didn't say anything more. Minister Fan also fell silent. A glimmer of confusion appeared on his face. The atmosphere in the study was somewhat strange. Presumably, the surviving nobles and officials in Jingdo were all silent in their own residences. No one had thought that the emperor would be able to come down from Dong Mountain alive. Amidst their shock, they thought of the Yi family's ambush in the rebellion and the many watertight calculations. All of the officials' respect and fear of the emperor had been raised to an unprecedented level. Fan Xian looked at his silent father and rose to say a few more words. He then turned and left. Walking out of the study, he headed toward the back garden behind the street to see Wan Er. Along the way, the night wind was as cool as water and blew against his face. He couldn't help but feel a wave of pleasure. He took a deep breath and maintained the injuries in his body. He thought blankly that Chen Pingping's letting go during the attack in the valley was a kind of separation. The old cripple lived up to his reputation as the most powerful person in the world. He had long seen through everything, yet he carefully hid the truth from Fan Xian and did those things alone. He also used these separations to maintain his safety afterward. Fan Xian had been learning from Chen Pingping, so he could only be silent tonight. His father was about to resign and return home. Why should he let his own guesses sink him into Jingdo's dangerous situation and be unable to free himself? For the sake of each other's safety, they had to separate each other. This was true love. Just like how Chen Pingping loved him. At this time, Fan Xian very much wanted to see Chen Pingping. Chen Pingping was leisurely traveling around Jingdo. Occasionally, he would give orders for the Overwatch Council to cooperate with the emperor's actions under heaven. Even if he wanted to return to Jingdo before the emperor arrived in the capital, it could not be tonight. However, someone had come to the Fan Manor to find Fan Xian. It was already late at night. Before Fan Xian could see his wife, he was helplessly asked to leave the manor. He looked at Gong Dian at the door and took a deep breath. Pushing down the threads of irritation in his heart, he bowed and said, "Sir Gong." Earlier, he and his father had been discussing this person in the study. He knew that he was one of the emperor's most trusted people, so he spoke with propriety. In Gong Dian's view, Sir Fan Jr. was the emperor's closest nephew. He did not dare to be arrogant. Bowing as a subordinate, he said in a low voice, "There is something I must trouble the Duke of Donbo with." Fan Xian was now a duke, so he was worthy of this bow. Furthermore, in the few days before the emperor returned to the capital, he was still a regent. Hearing the word trouble, Fan Xian knew it was going to be big trouble. He couldn't help but feel a real headache coming on. Too many people had died in Jingdo, so Fan Xian's mood was not very good. Battles were still raging around Jingdo, but the inside of the city had gradually calmed down. He desperately needed to rest and think. Being disturbed by someone, he did not have a good expression. However, was it so easy to be regent? Fan Xian forcefully pushed down the irritation in his heart and looked at him. Doing his best to calm down, he said, "What is it?" Gong Dian looked at him with some hesitation and difficulty. Even during the day, when he had attacked the military elder, the old Qin master, amidst tens of thousands of rebel soldiers, it had not been this difficult. Fan Xian didn't speak. He only looked at him calmly. Perhaps the pressure was too great. Gong Dian swallowed and said, "Please go to the manor." "I can't persuade the young mistress." Fan Xian immediately understood what had happened. During the day, he had been busy killing people and saving people. He had not thought of this at all. Now, in the dead of night, the smoke of battle had dissipated slightly. He immediately thought of the big trouble the Yi family was about to encounter after they had followed the emperor and made great contributions. The commander left the capital in pursuit, and ordered me to bring the young mistress back to the manor. Unexpectedly, the young mistress refused to obey. Gong Dian had stood guard at Zhangyang Gate for a long time at night. He knew that in Jingdo, probably only Fan Xian could handle this matter and had the right to handle royal matters. Thus, he no longer cared about Ding Zhou's face and spoke of the problem straightforwardly. Fan Xian continued to look at Gong Dian calmly and allowed him to speak. There was no disdain or mockery in his eyes. However, it made Gong Dian feel an inexplicable sense of unease and shame. Fan Xian took a deep breath and didn't say anything. In this entire matter, of the people still alive, the ones who suffered the most were probably Wan and her close friend, Yiling His wife was heartbroken over the death of her mother. Yiling grievance and anger would probably not be any less. When Yiling married the second prince, it could be said that they were congenial. However, no one would have guessed that this marriage was only a part of the plan between the emperor and Yi Zhong. In other words, Yiling couldn't even be considered a pawn. She had only given up her feelings in marriage to become a bargaining chip for the Yi family to win the eldest princess trust. Only when things came to a head did she suddenly realize that her father had wholeheartedly wanted to defeat her husband. Of course, her husband had wholeheartedly wanted to use her to control the Dingzhou army. Thinking of this, Fan Xian couldn't help but think of the words the eldest princess had said before she died. The men of the world were all controlled by fame, power, and the so-called ideal of uniting the world. They truly were not good people. Perhaps that included himself, but he asked himself if he could do such a thing. He felt endless loathing for Yi Zhong, who had sold his daughter. Gong Dian seemed to guess what he was thinking. His expression was very unnatural. Fan Xian shook his head and said, "Is the second prince also locked up in the manor?" Gong Dian made a noise of acknowledgement. Fan Xian lowered his head and said, "It's fine. On Dong Mountain, the emperor once said not to kill if possible, particularly Chengza." Gong Dian raised his head in shock. He knew of the news of the emperor's survival, but this was the first time he had heard that the emperor had personally given such an order to Fan Xian. If the emperor was truly willing to leave the second prince with his life, it would be a great blessing. Everyone in Dingzhou actually liked Yiling Now that the truth had been revealed and Yiling was mourning in the manor, all of the Dingzhou soldiers felt incomparable shame and unease. Hearing that the second prince did not need to die, Yiling did not need to be a widow, which made it easier to explain. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. Thinking of the emperor's orders on Dong Mountain, only now did he understand that the emperor had already confidently calculated that he would return to the capital safely, and that the eldest princess would lead the crown prince and second prince in defeat. Thus, he had purposely reminded him to leave the second prince with his life. Leaving the second prince with his life was actually leaving Yiling a man, and a sliver of face for the Yi family, who had performed meritorious service. Otherwise, if the second prince suddenly died, what would Yiling do? With the endless discussion under heaven, how would the Yi family live? Although the emperor had long calculated, Fan Xian still went to the manor. Even if he did not have any good feelings toward the second prince, Yiling had, after all, called him teacher countless times. Furthermore, as the regent, he had to handle the captured prince carefully. If something truly happened in the manor, it would be difficult for him to explain. He didn't raise his head to look at the signboard on the manor. Accompanied by Gong Dian, he walked straight in. There were soldiers watching all around. Even if the second prince still had strength in his hands, it would be difficult for him to transform into a mosquito and fly out of this cage. This was the first time Fan Xian had stepped into the second prince's manor. He couldn't help but feel strange. He didn't know what this brother, whose temperament, appearance and temperament were similar to his, was thinking. Gong Dian stayed outside the rear courtyard while Fan Xian went in alone. The garden was quiet and secluded, completely unlike the grand scene a manor should have. There were still lights in the room. It looked like although it was late at night, the young prince and Wang Fei still could not sleep. Entering the door, he saw Yiling alone. Her face was full of sorrow as she sat silently by the table. She didn't say a word. There were still traces of tears at the corners of her eyes. Her usually bright jade-like eyes now had an indescribable tiredness and grievance, as well as a hidden anger. Wang Fei was like a tiger that could pounce at any moment and bite someone to death. Putting aside the fact that she had been used by her husband, she had been deceived by her father, and she had been thrown out by her family. How could she bear it? A faint sense of pity rose in Fan Xian's heart. He walked to her side and said in an even voice, "Gong Dian had good intentions in having you return to the manor. After the matter fades in a few days, won't you and Chengza still be together?" Yiling was startled. Only now did she realize that it was him who had entered the room. The mockery in her eyes grew. She wanted to mock him, but her heart ached. She lowered her head and began to cry silently. Fan Xian had never seen Yi Ling so graceful and sorrowful. For a moment, he didn't know how to comfort her. A moment later, Yi Ling raised her head and looked at him with lifeless eyes. "You're not in the palace doing your job as regent. What are you doing in the manor?" "I'm trying to persuade you," Fan Xian replied straightforwardly. Yi Ling slowly shook her head. "Don't be stubborn. Your father can't do anything about this matter. After all is said and done, if the second prince had listened to your advice and not participated in this matter, there would not be today's situation." Looking at Yi Ling's sorrowful appearance, Fan Xian became angry for no reason. These years, he had used all his strength to attack the second prince. Hidden in his subconscious was an idea to use the Overwatch Council and the Emperor's trusted aides to cripple the second prince's power and cut off his thoughts of fighting for the throne. Unexpectedly, the second prince's desire for power was so strong. Additionally, with the eldest princess's clever teasing, this plan did not have the slightest effect. Yi Ling smiled sorrowfully and quietly said, "Teacher, I don't blame you for this matter. How he ends up is his own business. These years, even you can't beat back his burning desire. How can I, a woman, persuade him? You don't need to persuade me to leave the manor. He is involved in rebellion. Who would give him a way out?" Yi Ling's expression gradually calmed. "No matter what kind of person Xueqi is, he and I are, in the end, husband and wife. Since father and the people of the clan have never seen me as a person, it is good that I go with him. We can be husband and wife in the underworld. I think that in that lonely place, he won't still have his beautiful dreams of being an emperor." Fan Xian's heart froze. He could clearly see a glimmer of a will to die in Yi Ling's calm expression. In a trembling voice he said, "I'll tell you frankly, the emperor personally gave me an edict on Dong Mountain. Xueqi will not die." Hearing these words, Yi Ling abruptly raised her head. A glimmer of hope and unexpected joy flashed through her eyes. Immediately after, it dimmed, making Fan Xian a bit confused. Yi Ling shook her head and sighed quietly. "Everyone says that he appears gentle on the outside but is cold and heartless on the inside. Actually, these words are not wrong. Even his mother in the palace is polite to him. In his life, when has he ever felt any true warmth? Not only is he heartless to others, he is also very cold to himself. I am his wife. I understand him better than you outsiders. You don't know what kind of proud and conceited person he is in his heart. The complete failure this time was a great blow to him. Even if father left him a way out, how could he have the face to continue living?" She raised her head and looked at Fan Xian with a helpless and hurt gaze. After returning to the manor, he still refused to say a word. "I know that he already has thoughts of dying. If even I leave at this time and everyone in the world abandons him, his departure will certainly be very straightforward." Fan Xian took a deep breath and straightforwardly said, "Where is he?" The second prince, Li Xueqi, was squatting on a chair with a bunch of purple grapes in his hand. He was bringing them to his lips. Fan Xian had seen this scene countless times. Tonight, the second prince's hair was disheveled. There was an unreadable expression on his handsome face. The corners of his lips were slightly tilted as if he was laughing at something. His entire person appeared unusually dispirited. "If you die, who will take care of Lady Xu? What about Wang Fei?" Fan Xian sat across from him and spoke as calmly as he could. His eyes were level with the other person. It was as if he was looking at another version of himself. Fan Xian's temperament was very similar to the second prince's. This was news that had long spread through Jingdo. The two of them clearly did not look alike, but sitting across from each other, it was as if they were looking at themselves through a layer of mirrors. Fan Xian looked at the other person and thought to himself that if his mother was not Yi Qingmei and his identity was switched with the second prince, he would probably only be able to sit on a chair and eat grapes without spitting out the skin. The second prince seemed to have only just noticed Fan Xian's arrival. He smiled slightly and said, "Can I still survive?" Fan Xian had no choice but to repeat the emperor's edict. The second prince smiled self-mockingly and said, "To live like a yellow dog and be imprisoned in the manor for the rest of my life. When father's 100 years are almost up and before the new emperor ascends the throne, the Yi family will be slaughtered like a dog and then I will be ordered to die. Tell me, if I survive, will my future life be like this?" Fan Xian was silent. Since it is so, why should I burden that shameless father-in-law? The second prince shrugged his shoulders. Furthermore, there is actually no meaning in continuing to live like this. Fan Xian opened his mouth and said, "Looks like your ambition has finally been extinguished." The second prince suddenly stopped moving the grapes into his mouth. The purple grapes of early autumn were sweet and juicy. The smile on his face was also very sweet. He looked at Fan Xian and faintly said, "Now that I think about it, in the tea shop in front of Baoyue brothel, what you said was correct. During these 2 years, you have always wanted to extinguish my ambition. Thinking back, I must thank you. Speaking of which, it is strange. I wholeheartedly thought that my aunt would help me. Wholeheartedly thought that my father-in-law would help me. Looking back and forth, it was you, the greatest enemy of my life, who once had a glimmer of sincerity toward me." The second prince sighed in admiration. "You are truly an anomaly in the Li family. The young lady of the Yi family is indeed as unusual as the rumors say." "And me." The second prince continued to speak and laughed loudly. He laughed until tears and snot streamed down his face. "What am I? I thought that I schemed against others, that I had countless supporters behind me, and that the throne was just around the corner. Who would have thought that everything was arranged by father? And I, a clever person, was not even as good as a chess piece. I was not even as good as Cheng Qian, that coward. I could do nothing. I had no ideas. I was like a powerless child. I could only watch stupidly as all of this happened." The second prince was angry. His voice grew louder and louder. He didn't know what he was angry about, but it was clearly not directed at Fan Xian. Perhaps he was angry that he had been placed in the position of a whetstone by father since he was young, and was forced to walk step by step to where he was today. Perhaps he was angry at Yi Zhong's heartless betrayal. Perhaps he was angry that he was born in the royal palace. Fan Xian was silent. He had learned from Wan that this second brother, who had a good relationship with her since childhood, was nicknamed Stone. Even if he was a simple and stubborn stone, after being sharpened by the emperor with the sword of imperial power for so many years, for no reason, he would still carry some viciousness and negativity. "What am I?" The second prince Li Chengzi stared at Fan Xian and pointed at himself. Tears and snot streamed down his face. He laughed loudly and said, "I am a joke." Fan Xian wanted to say that in front of the emperor, it seemed that everyone in the world was a joke. However, he didn't say these words because he watched in shock as the laughing and crying second prince spat out a mouthful of black blood after saying the word, joke. A mouthful of black blood landed on the purple grapes. Chapter 584. Black blood sprayed onto the purple grapes and dripped down to the ground, wetting the floor illuminated by the lantern light. The second prince lowered his head and opened his mouth. There was a patch of blood on his lower jaw. His eyes were lowered. Without looking at Fan Xian, he raised his hand and stopped him from walking over. "The moment you entered the manor, I took the medicine." The second prince crouched on the chair with his head very low. Faintly he said, "I know you are Fei Jie's student, but the poison has already entered my heart. You can't save me. I also don't want you to save me. You have to know that although you are powerful, you can't stop me from dying." As long as a person had the will to die, no matter what method was used, it was impossible to save his life. Fan Xian understood this. He looked at the other person calmly. His heart was empty and had no thoughts. However, he was still not prepared to watch with folded arms. It was not because he had a glimmer of brotherly affection for the second prince. Rather, he could not let the other person die in front of him. "Don't worry about anything. I have already written my will earlier. The palace will not blame you. No one will think you killed me." The second prince lowered his head. His blood-stained hand fumbled in his clothes and pulled out a letter. Gently, he placed it on the table. Unexpectedly before he died, he had even thought of what Fan Xian was worried about. Fan Xian's heart froze slightly. He knew that the other person was as Linger said. He was ruthless toward himself to a certain realm and had cut off any hope of survival. The second prince raised his head and glanced at Fan Xian with an envious gaze. He then vomited up another mouthful of black blood. He used his sleeve to carelessly wipe his lips. Using 2 slender fingers, he carefully broke off the grapes stained by the poisonous blood. Leaving behind a small clean half, he sent it back into his mouth. The sweet and juicy grapes were chewed into mush in his mouth. The second prince spat out the grape seeds. He spat them onto the ground, still carrying black blood. After eating the grapes, he wiped his hands clean on his body and sighed. Looking at Fan Xian, who had been silent and not moving, he faintly said, "I don't want to continue living as a joke." Fan Xian nodded to indicate that he understood his thoughts. "Actually, you are also a joke." A layer of deathly gray gradually rose to the second prince's face. His gaze was slightly unfocused. Thinking of something, he said, "There are a lot of people in Jingdo who want to kill you." "Yes, the first person to act was me. But do you think Chengqian has been gentle toward you? The Qin family didn't kill you in the valley. He was so angry he jumped all night in the Eastern Palace." "But why?" He stared into Fan Xian's eyes. "Why is it that your attitude toward Chengqian is completely different from how you treat me?" Fan Xian himself did not understand this point. The second prince was about to die, and his words were also straightforward. They pierced straight into his heart. Why was it that he had always been so tolerant and gentle toward the crown prince, but pestered the second prince relentlessly and spared no expense? The second prince's eyelids drooped weakly, and his voice was extremely low. "You don't like me. You didn't like me from the beginning. Of course, I don't like you either. The two of us are too similar. It's just that I've never had such good luck as you. No matter who it is, no one will allow another to exist in the world. Everyone will unconsciously try to get rid of the other first." His gaze was cold and helpless. "If you are Prince Jia of the Ronggua Manor, then I can only be Zhan Baoyu of Jinling. I will never get many chances to appear in the novel. But I am the real one. I am the real one." As the second prince spoke, he coughed up blood. The blood was smeared all over the front of his clothes. He appeared very wretched. Fan Xian looked at the scene in front of him. His body was stiff and he couldn't make any reaction. The second prince raised his head for the last time and stared at Fan Xian's face. With some difficulty, he said, "I always thought Chengqian was the most cowardly of all the brothers. Only when I was about to die did I realize that I was also very cowardly. I would rather die and humbly leave Ling and Mother than have the courage to face. After I die, help me take care of Ling. As for Mother, her best ending is probably to be banished into the cold palace. Please help me take care of her." The second prince's chest rose and fell violently as if something was about to charge out. He stared into Fan Xian's eyes and forced himself to finish speaking. He didn't give Fan Xian any chance to speak. Opening his mouth, he spat out a large pool of black blood and stopped breathing. After death, the second prince continued to crouch on the chair with his left hand on his knee. His handsome face carried a deathly ashen color. A moment later, his body fell off the chair with a thud. However, his eyes refused to close and were wide open. Fan Xian looked at the second prince's body with a numb expression. He suddenly felt that this early autumn night could be so cold. He shivered. His emotions were complicated. He didn't know what kind of sigh he should make about the body in front of him. Perhaps silence was the best attitude. The second prince, the true prince, was already dead. How could the fake soul in his body continue? His expression was not very good. It was not because the second prince had committed suicide in front of him, nor was it because of the heart-wrenching words the second prince had said before he died. Rather, in the end, the second prince had asked him to help him take care of Ling and Lady Shu. He didn't even give him a chance to refuse? Fan Xian thought to himself. His expression was desolate. When the eldest princess died, she gave honor to him. The crown prince knew that he was going to die, so he entrusted the families of the rebel soldiers and officials to him. "Why? Don't you know that I am your irreconcilable enemy? Was your death not caused by me? Why do you throw so many burdens at me before you die? Do you want to crush me to death? Are you betting that I will help you? You dead people. If you die, then die. Why do you want me, a living person, to live so uncomfortably?" He lowered his head and was incomparably wooden. His body trembled slightly. He then walked to the side of the second prince's body and glanced at it. He picked up the thin will from the table and put it into his clothes. Then, he walked out of the sinister room. Walking to the bedroom in the back garden of the manor,
Yiling-er was still sitting woodenly under the cold light of the green lantern.
She had no idea what had happened in the back garden. Fan Xian sighed in his heart and walked directly behind her. Striking down with his palm, he didn't give her any chance to react before knocking her out. If he didn't knock her out, once she learned of the second prince's suicide by poison, she would probably follow him. Fan Xian could only use this more direct method to delay the matter. Gong Dian came forward to greet him. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a moment.
He then handed the will in his clothes to him. At the same time, he handed Yiling-er, who was on his shoulder, to him and said something in a low voice.
Gong Dian accepted the unconscious Yiling-er. He was already very shocked.
Hearing the news of the second prince's death, he furrowed his brows tightly.
The second prince wrote a will. The emperor won't blame you or me. Fan Xian sighed. Immediately after, he said seriously, before Wang Fei wakes up, first tie up her hands and feet. Then, tell her this news. If she doesn't want to eat, force rice soup down my throat. No matter what, she has to drink it. These last two sentences had already been roared out through gritted teeth. They were incomparably sinister. Gong Dian thought that this was indeed the only way. He didn't notice the Duke of Dombua's loss of composure.
After thinking for a moment, he helplessly said, "But, the young lady's personality is like a raging fire.
We can't tie her up for the rest of her life. Fire is not scary. It comes quickly and goes quickly. It's not as piercing as a lump of ice like me and the second prince," Fan Xian thought to himself.
Lowering his voice, he said, "After a few days, when things have calmed down a bit, I'll come and try to persuade her." After he finished dealing with the matters of the manor, the night in Jingdo had gradually receded.
It was already early in the morning. In the distant east, a faint sliver of white peeked out. However, Fan Xian had no way of resting. He still had too many things to do.
After circling back to the Fan Manor from the manor, he went directly to the royal palace.
Although Minister Fan had said that these matters should be handled by the Board of Rites Taichung Temple, Fan Xian could not forget his identity as regent and pretend these things had never happened. Furthermore, he was also the vice minister of Taichung Temple, Minister Ran Xiao, and had followed the emperor to Dong Mountain to worship heaven. He didn't know if he would survive. He and the great prince stood side by side.
Looking at the three black coffins in front of them, the two brothers were silent.
Just a day ago, the two of them had been standing on the palace walls worrying about the safety of the palace and the world of the Qing kingdom. Who would have thought that at this moment, victory and defeat had already been decided? The people who wrote the history of the world had already changed their names. Who would have thought that at the moment of danger in the royal palace, the black coffins under Fan Xian's feet had already begun to contain the skin of the defeated? The eldest princess and the second prince were lying quietly in the coffins. There was another coffin that was empty. No one knew who was going to lie in it next. This is not in accordance with etiquette. The great prince's expression was heavy. He struggled not to show sorrow between his brows. The eldest princess was one thing, but the brotherly affection between him and the second prince, Li Chengza, could not be faked. Although the two brothers had gradually drifted apart during these 2 years, looking at the scene in front of him and thinking of the people in the coffins, the great prince's heart still ached. Fan Xian nodded his head tiredly and said, "The officials of the Board of Rites have all been scared away. It looks like as long as the emperor doesn't return to the capital, the 6 ministries will not be able to be gathered together. There aren't many people in Taichung Temple either. They are just temporary accommodations. After all, the face of the royal family has to be taken care of. They can't just stay in the manor." The great prince sighed and didn't say anything more. He turned and walked into the royal palace. Compared to the group of imperial soldiers escorting the coffins, his figure appeared very desolate. Fan Xian looked at him calmly and shook his head.
He knew that in the face of the repeated heavy pressure and the gradually arriving news of death, the great prince was almost unable to hold out.
Thinking of this, only then did Fan Xian feel waves of exhaustion coming from the depths of his body. He could barely keep his eyelids open.
Furrowing his brows, he slapped his face and said to the subordinate beside him, "Return to the manor."
In one night, he had returned to the manor 4 times, but there was not a moment of peace. Fan Xian thought about it carefully.
From the beginning of the preparations before breaking into the palace, He had not slept for 2 days and 2 nights.
His injuries had already relapsed. The power of the ephedra pill had completely worn off. He didn't dare take it again. His entire body's energy and strength had indeed reached their limits. After returning to the manor, Fan Xian looked at everything in the dark night. He didn't go to see Wan'er, who was staying in Lady Lu's room. He lowered his head and sat silently on the bed for a while. He then kicked the black chest under the bed. Without even taking off his clothes, he laid down with his arms spread out. He was clearly exhausted, yet he couldn't sleep. He opened his bright eyes and looked at the dark ceiling. He didn't sleep for long before he woke up. After all, Jingdo was still in chaos. As the regent, he could not give himself too much time to rest and be sad. After getting out of bed, he randomly ate something and used a hot towel to soak his face, forcefully recovering his energy. As he walked out the door, he unconsciously glanced down at the bed. That fatal chest, the chest that often stayed in the dust, lay quietly under the bed. It was like the eldest princess and second prince lying quietly in their coffins. No one would ever disturb them again. Regardless of whether it was a chest or a person, perhaps only by becoming an unremarkable existence and placed in an unremarkable place could they obtain true peace. As he left the manor, he unconsciously glanced back inside. After returning from Taiping Courtyard, he still hadn't seen Wan'er. He didn't know what his wife's mood was. Thinking of this, a glimmer of darkness rose to his face. As he entered the palace, he unconsciously glanced toward the palace doors. There were fire and smoke marks everywhere on the red palace doors. Some of the cracks caused by weapons were gaping open, revealing the wood shavings inside. The copper nails that had been knocked off had long been cleaned up. There were only countless ugly scars left on the doors. In this instant, Fan Xian confirmed some things. This palace, this city, and this country were, after all, the place he had lived for 20 years. He had already developed deep feelings for this place. Even though this palace was cold and gloomy, even though this city had let down many people, and even though this country had made a great mistake, it was still his country. He had always thought of himself as a Qing person. There were many things that he had not investigated clearly. Before he understood them, he didn't mind doing his best to maintain the peace of the people in this country while he lived a beautiful life, just as he had done all these years. So many people had died, so he had to live well. Unless some people didn't want him to live. He invited the scholars Hu and Shu back to their manors to temporarily rest. These two officials had already been in the royal study drafting up the imperial edicts for an entire night. Some of the important memorials to the Qing kingdom had finally been roughly sorted out. However, the two scholars were not made of iron. Their mental state was much worse than Fan Xian's. After receiving a series of shocks and not sleeping, they were long exhausted. Fan Xian sat in the empty royal study and couldn't help but shake his head. Usually, when the emperor was here, although the royal study was just as quiet, it was always filled with a different feeling. Was it dignity? Or something else? In any case, it was completely different from the royal study he sensed. He didn't know how the emperor had come down from Dong Mountain alive, but he knew that his performance would certainly satisfy the emperor. It looked like his position as a powerful official could be secured. However, when he thought of the war that would open the curtains in 2 or 3 years, Fan Xian felt a bit of bitterness in his mouth. It was said that a gentleman did not bully a darkroom. However, Fan Xian was not a gentleman. He sat alone in the royal study looking at the mountainous piles of memorials on the low platform and the soft couch. He thought of how the emperor had been controlling the entire Qing kingdom's court politics from there. His heart jumped. He stood up and looked calmly in that direction. Slightly tilting his head, he wondered what it would feel like if he sat there. Immediately after, he shook his head. His thin lips twitched slightly, revealing a glimmer of self-mockery. Being regent for a day and night had almost tired him out like a big yellow dog in the summer. Looking at the wretched appearance of the scholars Hu and Shu being supported by the eunuchs, Fan Xian confirmed that the emperor's job was certainly more tiring than that of the Yellow Emperor, who had countless women every day. It was still that old saying. There were only 3 kinds of people in the world: men, women, and the emperor. Anyone who could be a true ruler was not a person. Invite the third prince over. Fan Xian smiled slightly and spoke to the little eunuch outside the royal study. He immediately thought of Hongzhu and some of the people involved in the rebellion who were still imprisoned in the cold palace. He didn't know how the emperor would handle this matter after he returned. However, in the eyes of an outsider, Hongzhu had basically done nothing, so there shouldn't be any major problems. In just a few years, the third prince Li Chengping, who had gradually grown into a youthful appearance, arrived outside the royal study accompanied by an old nanny and a few eunuchs. Fan Xian glanced at the old nanny and waved his hand for them to leave.
Holding the third prince's hand, he came to the front of the desk where the memorials were kept.
Li Chengping's hand was slightly cold. The gaze with which he looked at Fan Xian was also different from when he was in Jiangnan. It appeared to be somewhat respectful. Fan Xian had already noticed this scene out of the corner of his eye, but he did not care much. He was respectful and fearful, but there was no sense of alienation. He knew that his performance this day and night had left a deep impression on this brother of his. He would probably never be able to shake off this kind of mark. This was a problem in education. Other than Fan Xian, no one in this world understood it. In order to raise a prince who dared to open a brothel and kill people at the age of 9 into a kind ruler, pure moral teachings were not enough to complete the task. He had to let the third prince understand that there were many things in this world that could be achieved through more open and above-board methods. The third prince needed a role model. From the beginning of the Jiangnan trip, Fan Xian had set himself as the role model in the third prince's heart because he was an immortal poet, a warrior, a powerful official, and the savior of the third prince. In the hearts of most of the people of Qing Kingdom, he was a good person. Fan Xian hoped that the future emperor of Qing Kingdom would also be a good person, just like the crown prince.
Sir, I heard father.
Li Chengping looked at Fan Xian with some fear. Fan Xian smiled. With the temple above, the emperor has the mandate of heaven to protect him. Naturally, those thieves and rascals cannot harm him.
Oh!
A glimmer of joy rose to Li Chengping's face. Although he knew that if his father died, he would become the next emperor of Qing Kingdom under the protection of his teacher and brother, he was, after all, still a youth. His thoughts were not that ruthless. Fan Xian pretended not to care, but he carefully paid attention to the change of emotions in Li Chengping's eyes.
He thought to himself that he had indeed not seen wrong. In the future, the emperor will probably often have you come to the royal study to listen. After Fan Xian said this, he paused and slowly opened his mouth to say, "Your Highness should first familiarize yourself with the place." The third prince had come to the royal study before and knew that his brothers, the crown prince, his second brother, his eldest brother, and even his teacher would always listen to his father and the officials discuss matters in the royal study after the court meeting. However, after today, this royal study would probably be much emptier. "There are many things that probably no one dares to say to your Highness," Fan Xian said calmly after thinking for a moment. "But I must tell you."
The emperor was about to return. Fan Xian had to give his own explanation to the third prince because he knew that this child's thoughts were actually very meticulous. Earlier, he had always used "Your Highness" to refer to him. The great prince's nature is martial. In the future, he will be sent to the borders to guard. Fan Xian's expression was slightly heavy. Using his own words, he described the emperor's future plans. His nature is straightforward. He will not take the initiative to do anything that will harm the Brotherhood. You can rest assured on this point. Don't be suspicious. The third prince's hand trembled. Looking at his teacher's face, he didn't know why he was suddenly saying this. As for me, I will eventually leave. The world is so big. I have to go to the ends of the earth to take a look. Only then will I not have wasted my life. Fan Xian smiled slightly. So don't be suspicious of me. Even after you grow up. Don't be suspicious of me. The third prince opened his mouth wide. For some reason, he felt a glimmer of fear. These are not words that an official should say, Fan Xian withdrew his smile and calmly said. But, I want to say it to you. In the 20 years of my life, I have grown tired of guessing and testing each other's intentions. Regardless of whether or not you still believe these words when you grow up, please remember these words. Just as he had said, these words had already violated the emperor's family's great taboo. Furthermore, they had come from the mouth of an official. Yet, Fan Xian had said them so calmly and naturally. Li Chengping looked in a daze at his teacher's originally handsome but slightly sallow face and unconsciously nodded his head. 3 days had passed. Jingdo had already been pacified. The 3 riders once again entered the capital and announced to the world the news of the emperor's return from worshipping heaven. The Jingdo people, still shaken, were overjoyed. Standing on the palace walls, Fan Xian didn't know what they were happy about after suffering so much. The emperor's scheduled return to the capital was 3 days late. During these 3 days, the Dingzhou army's military intelligence reports came endlessly to the capital through the military and Overwatch Council's channels. Fan Xian had enough of being a regent. With both hands, he held the emperor's royal seal and randomly stamped it. On this day, the news finally arrived. Fan Xian brought the third prince, the great prince, and the surviving royalist old officials through the streets that still had the marks of war. Walking out of Zhangyang Gate, they stopped 10 li away. Thousands of people knelt down densely. There was no space on the road. Many people knelt directly in the wheat fields on either side of the road. At this time, the autumn harvest had not arrived. The golden ears of wheat survived the trampling of the war horses and swayed in the wind with the heavy harvest. Countless people's emotions swayed like the ears of wheat as they watched the bright yellow royal entourage coming from afar. Fan Xian pulled his gaze back from the wheat fields and smiled slightly at the nervous and joyful third prince beside him. After canvassing for votes yesterday, I rushed to second place in the monthly votes. In my memory, this seems to be the first time in the Qingyu year that I have reached second place. Although the second prince died quite tragically today, I am still as nervous and joyful as the third prince. Alas, I have lived most of my life as a bachelor. Thank you. Chapter 585. The royal carriage slowly arrived and steadily stopped on the road.
Because of the chaos and panic of the battle, the road had not been paved with yellow earth or sprinkled with water. However, the emperor's feet still did not have any hesitation.
Firmly and steadily, he walked down the steps and stepped onto the land around Jingdou. The emperor moved his hand away from eunuch Yao's elbow. His calm gaze slowly swept across the wilderness. Thousands of officials and soldiers were kneeling on the ground and worshipping him. His expression was indifferent, but there was not much emotion in his eyes. Amidst the earth-shaking mountain cries, the emperor's gaze moved closer from the distant Jingdou walls and landed nearby. It flashed past the scholars Hu and Shu, the great prince in martial attire, and his nervous and slightly happy youngest son. In the end, it lightly landed on Fan Xian's handsome and threatening face. He noticed that there was a strong sense of tiredness on this boy's face.
The corners of the emperor's lips twitched slightly with a hint of joy. It was as if he was growing to like this pretty face more and more in the depths of his heart. His brows immediately furrowed because he found that Fan Xian had suffered a serious internal injury. Spreading out his bright yellow dragon robe, the emperor stretched out his arms. Calmly and domineeringly, he faced the wilderness in front of him. The mountain cries gradually stopped. If no one dared to look at the emperor, how could these thousands of people know the emperor's actions? From the moment they got out of the car, the emperor's gaze had basically landed on Fan Xian. Fan Xian felt uncomfortable all over, but he kept his head down. He didn't know how to react. After hearing the cheers, the emperor's feet gradually moved toward them. Just as he was about to walk in front of Fan Xian, the emperor suddenly changed his direction and did not look at Fan Xian again. Solemnly, he helped Xu Wu and Hu the scholar to their feet. His hands gripped old Xu's shoulders. Using a gentle and firm tone, he said, "You've suffered."
Xu Wu's heart jumped. Fear appeared on his face. Hu the scholar also repeatedly said he didn't dare. The emperor smiled and didn't say anything. Immediately after, he helped up the great prince, who had led the soldiers in the Jingdou battle and achieved great merit. The emperor's emotions toward this eldest son he had never liked much were complicated, but his expression was calm. Following this, the emperor pulled Li Chengping up and used his right hand to gently stroke his youngest son's head for a while. His gaze looked around at the officials loyal to him and didn't say a word. Then, he turned around and walked back to the royal carriage. Everyone was dumbfounded, thinking that it was over just like that.
It was not about whether or not the emperor's return ceremony had finished. Rather, it was about the most meritorious service in protecting the country, the Duke of Donbua, still kneeling stiffly on the ground. Why did the emperor not say anything at all? Xu Wu and Hu the scholar met each other's eyes and saw the confusion in each other's eyes. Fan Xian was also a bit confused. He didn't know if he should stand up. Get up. Could it be that you won't be able to stand up if I don't help you up? Before he boarded the royal carriage, The emperor lightly tossed out these words to the crowd. Although these words did not point to anyone, everyone knew that they were directed at Fan Xian. Furthermore, they appeared cold, but in reality, there was a sliver of closeness within. As for the other meaning hidden in these words, only Fan Xian could understand. The emperor had already recognized his ability and loyalty. Without needing his support, he could also stand in his own position in court. Fan Xian laughed bitterly and stood up. He lowered his head to look at the dirt on his knees. Logically speaking, the emperor had not yet boarded the carriage. As an official, he could not clean up his appearance. However, an impulse came from somewhere and made his right hand brush at his knees, brushing away some of the dirt. This small action did not attract too much attention. It made the emperor's figure, who was about to board the royal carriage, pause slightly. Then, everyone heard the emperor's words. "Anji, come into the carriage." The officials began to stare dumbfounded again. They looked at each other and sank into shock. Earlier, the emperor had not personally helped Fan Xian stand up. Everyone had some guesses. Who would have thought that the emperor would immediately give Sir Fan Jr. such an honor to follow the emperor into the capital?
What kind of honor was this?
Even the crown prince had never enjoyed it in the past.
The gazes of the clever officials toward Fan Xian became heated. However, these officials appeared too clever, or perhaps they thought they were clever.
Some of their gazes involuntarily landed on the third prince. Everyone knew that the crown prince and the second prince would not have a good ending because of the rebellion. At the beginning, everyone thought that the future master of the Qing kingdom would be this young prince. Looking at the emperor's attitude, the reason these officials thought they were clever was because they had displayed an inappropriate attitude in an inappropriate place. The scholars Hu and Shu looked down as if they had not heard the emperor's words at all.
This was the difference between high-ranking officials and officials. Fan Xian tasted bitterness in his mouth, but he could not go against the imperial edict.
He walked to the side of the tall royal carriage, lifted the yellow curtain, and stood in front of the emperor.
Although the royal carriage was tall, it was still unable to allow a person to stand straight. Thus, he was forced to lower his head in front of the emperor, just like everyone else in the world.
"Sit." The emperor seemed to see through his thoughts and said with a slight nod of his head.
Fan Xian obeyed and sat across from the emperor.
Looking at the emperor he had not seen for a month, his emotions gradually became complicated. In the past, although the emperor had also had a bright and powerful side, he was not as terrifying as the emperor now.
The emperor was still calm, but he was like a bottomless abyss, hiding an unfathomable power. This kind of feeling made Fan Xian's heart palpitate. Looking at the two straight eyebrows and calm eyes, he involuntarily felt the thought of retreating rise in his heart. The emperor's domineering aura did not appear from his outer appearance. Instead, it appeared in the history books through his methods and results.
To be able to come back alive from Dong Mountain, to be able to arrange such a situation, and to be such a powerful figure, he was indeed worthy of being the foremost person in the land in 30 years.
Fan Xian understood this reality and could only accept it. The middle-aged man wearing the dragon robe lowered his head to look at the urgent memorials the two scholars had presented.
He did not pay attention to Fan Xian's gaze toward him, even if this kind of gaze toward the emperor was extremely impolite and taboo.
The royal carriage slowly began to move.
The light from outside the window slanted in and shone on the memorials in the emperor's hands. He lowered his head and furrowed his brows as he looked at these things.
Suddenly he said, 3 years. My Qing kingdom still needs 3 years.
When he said this, the emperor did not raise his head. It was as if he was talking to himself.
Fan Xian knew what the emperor meant. After experiencing an internal rebellion, putting aside the serious damage Jingdo had suffered and the chaos of court politics, just the internal attacks in the military had already caused serious consequences. The military's morale was already unstable. Additionally, the officials in the Dongshan Road area involved many people. Although the emperor had already chosen good officials from Jiangnan to replace them, the impact on the people's lives would certainly be great. It would take at least a year to gather the military's morale and remove the psychological effects of this chaos. The Qing kingdom would need at least 3 years to truly prepare for a large-scale battle in terms of wealth, resources, and the hearts of the people. Presumably, in the emperor's heart, this northern expedition to unify the world would be the last one. The progress of history that had been stopped by the two great grandmasters for over 20 years would slowly speed up. The light from outside the window shone in through the glass and endlessly brushed back, sprinkling countless glass flowers on the father and son's faces. The emperor still had his head down and said, "When the matter is done, brush off one's clothes and leave, hide one's body and name deeply. These are the words you once wrote. However, don't hope that I will let you go. When the matter is done, the matter is not over. Why is a young man like you in a hurry to brush off your clothes and leave?" The emperor's eyes looked at the memorial. These words seemed to have been spoken unintentionally, but Fan Xian's heart thumped. He didn't know what to say. When the matter was done, brush off one's clothes and leave. He had not thought that his unconsciously brushing off the dust in front of the royal carriage would allow the emperor to guess his thoughts. Furthermore, the emperor had resolutely and mercilessly dispelled his illusions or probing in his heart. He laughed bitterly and didn't dare to hide anything. Straightforwardly he said, "I am truly not good at things like fighting wars. It's better to peacefully earn some money for the court." Fan Xian had other plans in his heart, so he rushed to speak clearly. Unexpectedly, the emperor suddenly raised his head and looked at him. "Don't think about resigning. If you are still afraid of what people say, I will naturally do the matter of reducing your power." Fan Xian cried out bitterly in his heart. The emperor's words had forced him into a corner. If he was truly forced to stay in Jingdo to plot, he did not want his power to be reduced. The Overwatch Council was the most powerful weapon in his hands. If the emperor actually tore it open, what would he use to negotiate terms with this unfathomable emperor? Until now, he still didn't know the truth of what happened on Dong Mountain. He didn't dare to open his mouth to ask in the carriage. It was the emperor who spoke first and asked about the specific situation in Jingdo. Although Jingdo had continuously sent memorials to the royal carriage during these 3 days, the matter involved the secret of the royal family. There were many things that could only be reported personally by Fan Xian to the emperor. Fan Xian's voice rang out in the carriage. From the moment he left Dong Mountain to when he disguised himself as an oil merchant to enter Jingdo, to the later plan with the Great Prince, the surprise attack on the royal palace, and finally the Yi family's attack, he spoke methodically and clearly. He purposely downplayed some details that the emperor presumably did not want to hear. When Fan Xian made his report, the emperor had already lowered his head again. That was why he carefully watched the emperor's expression and reaction. Unexpectedly, regardless of whether it was the news of the eldest prince's death or the second prince's suicide, none of them made the emperor's stone-like face tremble at all. It was only when he reported the Empress Dowager's illness that the emperor raised his head. "How many days does the Empress Dowager have left?" "I've seen her at the Imperial Academy of Medicine. Her body is weak and she has experienced such a major event. She has been frightened. I'm afraid." Fan Xian stopped talking. He had a malicious thought toward the cold emperor. The Empress Dowager was scared to death by you. What should you, as a filial emperor, do? The Imperial Academy of Medicine? The emperor furrowed his brows and looked at him coldly. "What is the use of those pieces of trash? You were in the palace. Don't you know the details?" Fan Xian said darkly, "It is indeed not something a person can reverse." Under the gazes and protection of countless people, the emperor's entourage entered Jingdo. Following the wide and straight Tianhe Avenue, it entered the royal palace. Along the way, the common people who had just suffered the disaster of war forcefully suppressed the sorrow or fear in their hearts and joyfully welcomed the emperor's return. It was as if they were welcoming back the backbone of their lives. From this, it could be seen that the emperor's prestige and reputation among the Qing people was still as strong and unbreakable as monarchical power itself. Arriving at the front doors of the royal palace, Fan Xian retreated from the carriage with his body bent. Meeting the great prince's gaze, he shook his head, indicating that the emperor's mood was fine and had not been affected by the successive news of deaths. Fan Xian followed the carriage into the palace. Looking at the bright yellow curtains, he couldn't help but think of the emperor's expression earlier. Involuntarily, he felt a chill in his heart. Although the eldest princess and the second prince were both the masterminds of the rebellion, they were, after all, the emperor's own sister and son. Furthermore, looking at the rebellion now, it was clear that the emperor had purposely set up a trap for the other party. Yet, after learning of the death of his sister and son, the emperor was still calm. This determination, this cold-bloodedness, truly made him shiver in fear. The great prince walked to his side and said in a heavy voice, "Why did you come down? Did you dare to sit all the way into the palace?"
Fan Xian glanced at him and explained in a low voice. The emperor asked some questions in the carriage.
You know that it is not convenient to announce these things in public.
There was originally no need to explain anything to the great prince.
However, Fan Xian looked at the gazes focused on him from all around. He knew what kind of discussion and consequences it would cause if he followed the royal entourage into the capital, so he unconsciously added this sentence. After he finished, he felt that talking to the great prince like this would probably have the opposite effect. He smiled bitterly and said, "It was too cold in the carriage, so I came down to stretch my bones." The great prince smiled and patted his shoulder. He didn't say anything. These two brothers were actually both forcing themselves to smile.
Guarding Jingdo to prevent the ruler of a country from becoming a lonely spirit in the land, without question, they had performed a great service, a great service. However, so many people in the royal family had died, and they had used so many tricks.
Who knew what the emperor was thinking? The Qing emperor didn't think of anything. In the process of arranging to wipe out the rebel army outside the capital, he had already learned of Li Yunrui and Li Cheng's deaths from the urgent documents Fan Xian had sent. In the carriage, he only learned the specific circumstances of their deaths from Fan Xian's mouth. His expression was calm, as if the people who had died were strangers. He continued to look at the memorials the Hall of Governmental Affairs had presented. When the royal entourage entered the palace and Fan Xian got off the carriage, the emperor put down the memorial in his hands.
Leaning against the back of the chair, he closed his eyes and said nothing in silence.
The lonely silence continued for a long time. A glimmer of old age and haggard gradually appeared on the emperor's face. At this moment, the carriage had already stopped in front of Han Dian. He gently sighed and slowly walked out of the carriage curtain that eunuch Yao had pulled up. Once he was out of the curtain, he looked down at the familiar yet strange palace.
His expression quickly became calm and solemn. There was no longer a trace of the gloominess he had when he was alone in the carriage. Every brow and gaze conveyed his strength and strength. The Empress Dowager wore a plain white dress and lay on the warm and soft phoenix bed. The wrinkles on her face were deep. It was as if she had once faced too much wind and rain with this royal palace and had been eroded to this state. The emperor said something to the terrified imperial physician kneeling on the ground. He then sat by the side of the bed and placed his slender fingers on the Empress Dowager's wrist. Fan Xian and the other two brothers stood obediently behind the curtain, not daring to disturb them. Fan Xian's heart was faintly nervous. He could faintly see that the emperor's technique in taking the pulse was very skilled. It was clear that he also had some understanding of medicine.
However, he had more confidence in Sir Fei Jie's medicine. Most importantly, that pill was not poison.
Regardless of whether it was the Imperial Academy of Medicine or other brilliant doctors, presumably, none of them would be able to find the true reason for the Empress Dowager's gradual decline.
Instead, they would straightforwardly conclude that she was getting old and weak and that her fate was coming to an end. The emperor's slender fingers had already left the Empress Dowager's weak pulse. He lowered his head and thought deeply for a moment. A glimmer of helplessness flashed through his eyes.
It looked like this great grandmaster also knew that he could not delay his mother's departure. Then his brows suddenly furrowed.
His finger moved like the wind and tapped between the Empress Dowager's brows. With the tap, the atmosphere in Hongguang Palace changed. The cold autumn wind was dispersed by a wave of unstoppable sunlight. A powerful and upright aura passed into everyone's heart. Fan Xian suddenly felt the aura behind the curtain. His heart jumped, and his fingers began to tremble rapidly. Although this aura was not familiar, it was as harmonious as the zhenqi in his body. However, it was many levels higher than his realm. Faintly, it was the realm he had always longed for but had never been able to find the door to. He abruptly raised his head and stared in a daze through the thin curtain. A voice in his heart cried out to him. This is the second half of the volume. This was the second half of the volume that he had practiced for 20 years but had no progress at all. I seem to have made the same mistake as the rapeseed flower in Vermilion Bird. It looks like I am walking down the path of not distinguishing between the 5 grains. Fortunately, this is the Qing Kingdom. The title of this chapter is the second half of the father and son. Everyone should know that this is a pun. This story is about to enter the final stage. There are still about 6 or 7 more chapters in this volume. Then, it will enter the last volume, Emperor of the Dynasty. I have confidence that this is a corrected version. I mistyped the name of the last volume earlier, You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.